Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Back in 1994, I was living a pretty uneventful life in Flagstaff, Arizona. I was a junior accountant at the time, and my days were all about numbers and routine. I remember that weekend like it was yesterday. My friend Greg and I had planned a simple camping trip in the Coconino National Forest. Nothing too crazy, just a quick getaway. We left early on a Saturday, driving down this long dirt road deep into the woods. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel both at peace and on edge at the same time. The wind through the pines had this constant whisper, and it felt like we were getting ourselves into something beyond the normal weekend camping trip. We picked a spot near a small, clear creek. The water was so clean you could see the smooth stones at the bottom. We set up our tents, laid out our gear, joked around to keep things light. The whole area felt a bit eerie, but in a way that's hard to explain. Maybe it's just how remote it was. As the afternoon went on, we got a small fire going and started making a simple dinner on a portable stove. Everything felt pretty normal. Greg was telling me some dumb story about work, and I was half listening, half staring at the sky. As the sun started dipping, the colors turned those orangey red shades I've always loved. The forest got quieter in some ways, but there were these weird, distant rustling sounds, just enough to keep your senses on alert. After it got fully dark, we sat by the fire, comfortable but alert, looking at the stars. The trees were tall, and their branches formed these shapes overhead that just messed with your mind if you stared too long. It must have been around 10 p.m. when I started feeling this unease. I kept glancing toward the trees. At first I thought I was just spooking myself, typical camping jitters. But then I heard it, a heavy step on dry leaves. Not just a squirrel or a deer's light step. This was heavier, like a person wearing boots, but more dragging. It was off to my left, about maybe 30 feet away, right where the light of our lanterns didn't quite reach. I remember standing up and grabbing my flashlight without really thinking it through. Greg noticed my shift in mood and asked what was up, but I just waved him off and took a few steps toward the sound. I moved slowly because I was nervous, but also curious. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, showing me trunks, branches, and needles on the ground. Then I saw it. This massive figure, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that wasn't exactly smooth, kind of matted in places. It had these broad shoulders and a head that seemed to slope in a strange way. I couldn't make out every detail, but I know what I saw. It looked right at me. Its eyes had this weird shine to them, reflecting my flashlight in a way that made me feel instantly vulnerable, like I was doing something I shouldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I backed away, almost stumbling. I must have muttered something because Greg got up and rushed over. I told him I saw someone, or something, just over there. He looked at me like I was overreacting, but he grabbed his flashlight too. The two of us moved closer, but now we saw nothing. It was gone. We listened, holding our breath, and heard what I can only describe as heavy branches snapping somewhere deeper in the woods. And then this low, guttural sound, almost like a grunt or a deep moan. Not quite like a bear, not like any animal sound I've ever heard. It hit me like a punch of cold fear in the chest. We stood there for a moment, paralyzed, listening. The forest felt thicker, like it was pushing in on us. Greg looked at me, and I saw that fear in his eyes now too. He didn't say much, but we both understood we had to leave. We rushed back to our campsite and started tossing everything back into the car in a total panic. No neat packing, just grabbing stuff. The fire was still going, but I didn't care about extinguishing it properly. I just wanted out of there. Every sound seemed louder, branches cracking, leaves rustling. The distant creak suddenly felt closer. I could feel eyes on me. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? That's what I felt. I could swear I heard heavy footsteps circling just beyond our line of sight. As we stumbled our way back toward the car, which was about a 5-minute walk from the campsite, I kept looking over my shoulder. I never saw it clearly again, but I caught glimpses, shadows moving between tall pines, that same shine of eyes for just a split second. Every step felt like it took hours. The ground was uneven, and every twig snapping under our boots sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Greg kept whispering, keep moving, barely audible, but I could sense his urgency. I tried to keep my flashlight on the trail, but my hands were shaking so badly the beam was all over the place. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys. My hands were sweaty, and my heart was still racing. I managed to get the door open, and we threw our stuff inside, not caring if it was organized or even safe. I glanced back one more time. That's when I saw those eyes again, just for a moment, in the darkness behind a cluster of trees. It blinked, or maybe moved its head slightly, and then it was gone. The strangest thing was how quiet it got right at that moment. No wind, no insects, no distant animal calls, just this heavy silence that pressed on me. We got the engine started and took off without saying a word. The drive out felt surreal. We didn't talk much, just stared straight ahead, checking the rearview mirror more than we needed to. When we reached a small town nearby, we found a park ranger named Jim. I just needed to tell someone to see if I was losing my mind. Instead of laughing, Jim just listened and nodded. He said other people had reported strange sightings in the area, but there was nothing concrete. He didn't try to convince us we were wrong, and he didn't try to explain it away. He kind of accepted it, like these stories were just part of that forest's reality. I never went back to that exact spot. I don't think I ever will. To this day, I still remember the smell of the pines, the sound of the creek, and the weight of that silence. I can't prove what I saw. I know plenty of people will say it was a bear or my imagination, but I know that feeling in my gut. I've seen bears before. This wasn't a bear. This was something else, something tall, hairy, and all too aware of my presence. I could feel its intelligence somehow, like it was sizing me up, observing me, deciding what to do. Even now I get a chill thinking about it. I sometimes catch myself looking at old maps of the Coconino National Forest, tracing that old route, wondering if it's still out there, watching. We packed up and left so fast that night, it was almost as if we never meant to be there at all, like we were trespassing in a place that didn't belong to us. After that encounter, I just stopped underestimating the unknown. The forest swallowed that moment back up, and time moved on. Greg and I hardly talk about it anymore. I think we both know we saw something that night, something we still can't fully explain. And after all these years, I'm not sure I want to. Story 2. I know this might sound like something out of a bad movie, but I swear this happened to me back in 2002, in Oak Ridge, Oregon. I had just moved out there, away from the city I'd always known, to live in a small cabin surrounded by dense forest. I wanted peace, quiet, maybe see some rare birds, and just enjoy the stillness of nature. That day started pretty normally. I woke up early, sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, and just stared at the trees. No traffic, no voices, just my own breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. It was calming, exactly what I was looking for. At some point that morning, I heard this scream. It cut right through the silence, and honestly, it didn't sound human. It wasn't like the bark of a coyote or the screech of some big bird of prey. It was deeper, more raw, and I could feel it in my chest. I remember actually standing up so fast I nearly spilled my coffee. I tried to convince myself it was some animal I wasn't familiar with, maybe a mountain lion or something, but I'd never heard anything like that before. And I'd done a bit of reading before moving here, tried to learn the local wildlife sounds. This didn't match any of them. I grabbed my flashlight. Though it was still daytime, the forest floor can get pretty dark under thick canopy, and set off in the direction of that sound. I know it was reckless, but I felt this weird pull of curiosity. The trails near my place were barely marked, more like faint paths of flattened foliage than proper trails, and as I moved deeper in, I noticed something strange. The ground had these footprints, not like boot prints or the shape of a bear's paw. These were huge, longer and wider than any human foot I'd ever seen, with what looked like distinct toe impressions. There was no way someone was walking around barefoot out there, not with that size. It made the hairs on my neck rise. I kept scanning the forest floor with my flashlight, even though the sun was still up. It was just that dim under the trees. After a few minutes I heard it again, a low guttural sound, like a growl or a grunt, and it was closer than before. My heart started pounding. I didn't see anything at first, just ferns and thick moss covering old logs, the trunks of massive trees blocking my view. But then, as I swung the beam of my flashlight upward through the undergrowth, I saw it. This thing was tall. I mean, really tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair. It was standing partially behind a tree, and I caught a glimpse of its profile. Broad shoulders, long arms, and the face. I couldn't make out every detail, but its eyes caught the light and reflected it back at me. It was watching me, not running away. I've seen bears in zoos, and this thing wasn't a bear. There was something almost human-like about the posture and the way it was leaning out to look at me. I swear I stopped breathing for a few seconds. I took a step back, not wanting to provoke it. I wasn't armed, had no idea what I was dealing with. The air around me felt heavier, like I was suddenly hyper-aware of every branch and twig. Just then, I almost jumped out of my skin because I heard a voice behind me, a human voice this time. A woman, calling out weakly, "Hey, excuse me?" I spun around, startled, and there was this woman, maybe in her late 20s, looking disoriented and scared. She said her name was Samantha, and that she'd gotten lost on a nearby trail. I didn't ask a lot of questions right then because I was still freaking out about what I'd just seen. My only thought was that we needed to get the hell out of there. I whispered to her that we weren't safe in that spot, not explaining everything, just telling her something big was out there. She must have sensed my fear because she didn't argue. We turned and started heading back toward my cabin, trying to retrace my steps. The forest felt different now, as if we were being watched from all sides. I kept hearing these heavy footsteps, like something big was pacing around us, but whenever I turned, I saw nothing. Branches snapped in the distance. I could feel Samantha's tension too. She barely spoke, just stayed close behind me as I moved as quietly as I could. By the time we reached the clearing near my cabin, the light was starting to change, getting that late afternoon glow. We hurried inside, and I locked the door right away. It felt ridiculous. What was a simple wooden door going to do against something that size? But it was all I had. Inside, I tried to calm myself down and even cracked a nervous joke about the worst neighbor I've met so far. Samantha gave a strained smile, but she was pale. I could see her hands shaking slightly. She admitted she had heard strange sounds too, and was relieved just to be inside. We sat there in the dim light, keeping quiet, listening. Every now and then, we'd hear something heavy moving outside the cabin. Not running, not charging at the walls, just walking around slowly. Sometimes there was this low grunt, sometimes the sound of twigs snapping. I remember thinking how thin the walls suddenly felt, My flashlight beam flickered a bit, and I felt a surge of panic. Last thing I needed was to be left in total darkness. I found some spare batteries and swapped them in quickly, hands trembling, heart racing. After what felt like hours, but probably was only a short while, I realized we couldn't just stay there. Samantha needed to find a way back to wherever she came from, and I wasn't about to spend the night alone in that place after what I'd just seen. So I took a deep breath, threw together a few essentials, and we decided to make a break for it. I wanted to reach a nearby dirt road I'd noticed a couple of miles back when I first moved in. It wasn't well known, but if we found it, maybe we could hitch a ride into town, or at least get closer to civilization. We stepped outside slowly. The woods were strangely quiet now, except for the occasional distant rustle. As we started walking, I kept the flashlight aimed ahead, trying not to think about the massive shape I'd seen earlier. My eyes scanned every tree trunk, every patch of tall grass. Samantha walked right behind me. I could almost feel her fear radiating off her. Every crack under my foot sounded deafening, and we froze several times, thinking we heard something circling back toward us. It was nearly twilight when we reached that old dirt road. I'd never been so relieved to see a patch of open space. It was just a rough lane cutting through the woods, but it felt safer somehow. Luck was on our side because after maybe 20 minutes, a pickup truck came bouncing along. The driver, an older guy with a skeptical look, agreed to give us a lift after hearing we were lost. I could tell he thought we were either crazy or just city folk spooked by the dark woods. I didn't bother explaining too much. I just wanted to get out of there. We ended up in the small town nearby, a place with one main street and a handful of shops. We tried talking to the local cops about what we saw. They gave us these looks, some curious, some dismissive. I guess I can't blame them. I had no proof, no photos, nothing but my rattled nerves and a set of strange footprints no one else saw. Samantha thanked me and left to figure out where to go next, and I sort of just wandered around, feeling dazed. I'd come here for peace and quiet, and instead I'd stumbled onto something I still can't fully understand. A few days later, I know I'm jumping ahead, but I want to wrap this up. I got a call from some guy named Dr. Thomas King. He said he'd heard from someone that I'd encountered something unusual out in the woods. He was polite, asked questions, said he was into researching cryptozoological phenomena, which basically means creatures that aren't officially recognized by science. He took my story seriously, didn't laugh once, said he'd collected reports of a tall, hairy, primate-like creature in certain regions, and Oak Ridge was one of them. He couldn't prove anything, of course, but hearing someone not immediately dismiss me actually helped me feel less crazy. In the end, I packed up a few weeks later and decided not to stay at that cabin. The peace I wanted was gone. I kept replaying that day in my head. The screams, the footprints, the massive shape watching me, the sense of being stalked. I still get chills thinking about it. I've never been back there, and I never got any real explanation, either from the cops or from that researcher. I'm just left with the memory and the uneasy feeling that something is still out there, lurking among those trees. I'm not writing this to convince anyone. I know how it sounds. But all I can say is that on that single day in 2002, I experienced something I can't explain. It started out quiet and calm and ended with me running for my life from something I didn't know existed. To this day, I have no idea what I ran into. All I know is I don't want to meet it again. Story 3. I still remember that day in 2018 like it happened yesterday. My wife Allison and I had just settled into a small cabin we'd rented near Townsend, Tennessee, right at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains. We wanted a break from our hectic jobs and the endless noise of the city, and the idea of quiet streams, thick woods, and fresh mountain air sounded perfect. Our cabin was nothing fancy, just a sturdy wooden structure surrounded by dense foliage. We'd unpacked earlier in the afternoon and decided to go for a short walk before the sun dipped too low. We followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the trees. It wasn't a well-known trail, just something we'd spotted from the porch. The further we went, the quieter everything became. No more distant car sounds, no more casual chatter, just the wind through leaves, the hum of insects, and the occasional bird call. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. After maybe 20 minutes of walking, we noticed something odd on a patch of soft ground near a small stream. At first, I thought it was just a strange imprint caused by rainwater, but Allison pointed out that it looked like a footprint, only it was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. The shape was somewhat human-like but broader, and we could clearly see 5 toes. The edges were crisp, like something very heavy had pressed into the damp earth. There were a few more prints leading away from the stream and off toward a thicker part of the woods. I remember that tingling at the back of my neck as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear's distorted paw print or a prank by some local trying to scare tourists. Allison didn't say much, but I could tell she was uneasy. We exchanged looks, unsure whether to follow the prints or turn back. For some reason, curiosity, I guess, we decided to at least see where they led. We stepped carefully, the forest getting a bit dimmer as afternoon slowly shifted toward evening. As we advanced, something in the air changed. There was a smell, not overpowering but unsettling. It reminded me of damp fur and something else I can't quite name, like rotten wood or stagnant water. It was unpleasant, and it was getting stronger. A few steps more and we came across what looked like a small clearing. This is where things got really weird. There were objects scattered around, old, beat-up backpacks, torn pieces of plastic bags, even a mangled hiking boot half buried under some moss. Nothing I saw looked brand new. It could have been old junk left behind by careless hikers. But it felt off. The way these items were positioned didn't seem random, more like they'd been examined and then tossed aside. The backpacks were ripped, zippers broken, straps snapped. It clearly wasn't just weather damage. Something had rummaged through these things, possibly looking for food or just out of curiosity. Standing there, my heart was pounding, and Allison was looking around nervously. Neither of us said a word. It's like we were both waiting for some explanation to fall into our laps. And then we heard it. A deep, resonant sound, like a guttural roar or grunt, echoing from somewhere behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing in sight, just layers of trees and thick underbrush. Whatever made that noise sounded big, and it sounded close. I've heard bears before, at least from a distance, and this didn't quite fit that profile. It wasn't a long, rising roar, nor was it the short huffing sound you sometimes get from black bears. It had a strange pitch to it, a sort of hollow depth, like a big chest cavity pushing out a single aggressive note. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Allison grabbed my wrist and whispered, "We should go." I didn't argue. We carefully backed out of that clearing, trying not to make noise. I felt like I was being watched from every angle. We walked quickly but not so fast that we'd make a racket. As we retraced our steps, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I never saw anything move, but I'd get these sudden bursts of panic, as if any second something was about to burst out of the trees. By the time we made it back to the cabin, the sun was going down, and the light was a hazy orange through the leaves. We bolted the door and locked every window. Normally, in that peaceful setting, we'd sit out on the porch and have a drink, but not that night. We lit a small lantern inside and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. We spoke in hushed tones, almost like we were afraid our voices would carry out into the darkness. Could it have been a bear? A big one, maybe, but those footprints didn't look like bear tracks at all. A person. Not with feet that size, unless someone was wearing enormous fake feet. But why? And who would do that out here, ripping through old gear and roaring like a wild animal? Allison mentioned local legends she'd heard about strange creatures in the Smokies, things like the so-called Bigfoot or some other elusive mountain beast. We both tried laughing it off, but neither of us really found it funny. We had planned on maybe cooking outside on the fire pit that evening, but we scrapped that idea fast. Instead, we stayed indoors, speaking softly, our eyes darting to the windows whenever we thought we heard something, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, a loud thud echoed from somewhere outside, not close but not far enough for comfort. I remember the feeling in my chest, that suffocating anxiety that made my skin feel too tight. Allison was pale, gripping her mug of tea so hard her knuckles went white. I barely slept that night. I kept expecting to hear more growls or see a huge shadow passing by the window. Instead, I heard odd, distant sounds, soft knocks on wood, faint whistles that didn't sound like birds, branches creaking in a way that seemed deliberate rather than random. It could have been my imagination going into overdrive, but at the time, it felt real and very, very wrong. When it finally got quiet, well after midnight, I still couldn't relax. My eyes burned from straining to see something outside. The lantern flame flickered, casting jumpy shadows on the walls. Every time the wind blew, the cabin's old beams groaned, and I'd jolt upright, my heart pounding all over again. By morning, when a pale light seeped through the curtains, we were both exhausted and on edge. We ended up leaving early for town that day, though I know you said not to mention too many separate days. I just have to say that we did talk to a local ranger afterward. He listened carefully and didn't laugh at us. He mentioned people occasionally reporting strange sightings and sounds, calling it a shadow beast or some local legend. He told us to keep our distance from remote areas. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot that day. I didn't get a clear look at anything, but something was there, something big, something that made those impossible footprints and rummaged through old gear. The way it made that deep, resonant sound still gives me chills. I can't explain it. We never found definitive proof, and we never had another encounter like that. But that day changed how I think about the wilderness. Those mountains hold more than just pretty trails and waterfalls. There's something else lurking in those shadows, something that might have been watching us before we even knew it was there. Even now, thinking back, I get goosebumps. The feeling of being watched, the smell in the air, the sound that didn't belong to any animal I know, it all stuck with me. We ended our trip without any dramatic confrontation or flashy encounter. It just sort of ended. The noises stopped, the night passed, and we left with more questions than answers. That's the part that haunts me the most. It just stopped, like it never happened, and yet I know it did. I felt it in my bones that day, and I still feel it now, telling you about it. Story 4. I still remember it like it happened yesterday, even though it was back in 1990. I was living in Cedar Grove, Idaho, working as a commercial painter. It was a pretty quiet place at the time, surrounded by endless stretches of forest. Nothing much ever seemed to happen there, and honestly, that's what I liked about it. I enjoyed my routine. Wake up early, throw my gear in the old pickup, and head out to whatever job needed doing that day. But I'll never forget the afternoon when I heard something in the woods that I still can't explain. It was late in the day, and I was running a bit behind on a job. I remember the light, kind of that tired golden glow you get before dusk when the sun filters in low through the trees. I decided to take a back road that cut through a less traveled area. I knew these woods pretty well, or at least I thought I did. I'd grown comfortable around them, never feeling threatened. There was a small, unofficial path just off the dirt road, not marked on any map. People didn't usually go there, maybe a few hunters or teens looking for privacy, but it wasn't a popular spot by any means. As I rolled slowly down that bumpy track, I heard something that made me shut off my engine and just listen. It sounded like muffled yelling, like someone was in pain or panicked, coming from inside the forest. It wasn't clear, but it definitely didn't sound right. I stepped out, leaving my truck by the roadside, and stood there for a moment, trying to pick up the sound again. The trees were thick, the underbrush dense, and a heavy silence settled in when I stopped moving. My heart was thumping, but I felt I had to check. Maybe someone needed help. I walked in carefully, calling out a quiet "hello" every few steps, but I didn't raise my voice much. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare anyone, or maybe I didn't want to scare myself. As I made my way deeper, I noticed something strange scattered among the ferns and fallen branches. Camping gear, a few backpacks, some clothes, random utensils, all tossed around like someone had just dumped them. Some were torn, others looked untouched, but oddly placed. The arrangement didn't make sense. It wasn't like a camp was set up. It was more like someone had fled in a hurry and dropped their stuff. That's when I felt it. This is the part that's hard to explain, but I felt watched. I really felt it, like a weight pressing down from all sides. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling squirrels, nothing. Just me, my breathing, and that lingering sense that something, somewhere, was observing every step I took. I tried to keep calm, but the tension was hitting me hard. I remember thinking that maybe I should back away, that I had no business poking around. I took another look at those belongings. Some of it looked expensive, like nice hiking boots and even a camera lens, but no camera body in sight. It didn't fit any normal scenario. I didn't want to assume the worst, but something felt off. I leaned down and touched one of the backpacks. It was dirty, but not soaked or covered in leaves like it would be if it had been there for days. This seemed recent. Suddenly, I heard a branch snap loudly off to my left. I froze. The sound wasn't small. It was the kind of crack you get when something heavy steps on something solid. I looked in that direction, squinting through the low light. At first, I saw nothing but dense shapes of trunks and foliage. Then something moved, something large. It stepped partially into view, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and broad, with thick dark hair covering its body. It stood upright, but not stiff like a person. The proportions were just wrong. The shoulders were massive, the limbs powerful, and the face, though partially hidden by a layer of dark, matted hair, had features I can't easily describe. The eyes reflected what little light remained, catching it in a way that made them seem to glow. They were focused right on me. My heart started pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it. I didn't move. I held my breath. I had no idea what to do. The creature made a low, guttural sound, not exactly a growl, but more like a deep warning. That's what it felt like, a warning. It didn't charge at me. It didn't retreat immediately. It just stood there, letting me know I was trespassing, that I was not welcome. I slowly stepped backward. I tried to keep my eyes on it without looking like I was challenging it. Every step I took seemed like it took an eternity. I tripped over a small log and nearly fell, and in that panicked second, I lost sight of it. When I looked back up, it was gone, melted back into the dark shapes of the forest. But I could still feel it there, somewhere close. I remember turning and practically half running, half stumbling my way out of that patch of woods. Once I got back to my truck, I fumbled the keys and struggled to get the engine going. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the silhouette between the trees, just a hulking shape before it vanished behind the trunks. If I had blinked, I might have missed it. I'm not even sure if I trust my memory on that part now, but at the time it felt real. I drove straight into Cedar Grove and found the sheriff. I know how I must have sounded, like a nervous wreck. The sheriff looked at me with raised eyebrows, probably thinking I was either drunk or losing my mind. I described the creature as best I could. The sheriff didn't laugh exactly, but he definitely didn't seem convinced. He asked if I was sure it wasn't just a bear. But it wasn't a bear. No bear stands and stares at you like that. No bear leaves that kind of presence behind. Word traveled fast in our little community. I guess it's not every day someone comes in talking about a giant hairy creature in the woods. A few people came up to me later and admitted they had seen something strange out there in the past. Unusual footprints, strange noises, but they never really talked about it publicly. One older woman, Harriet, pulled me aside a day or two later. She told me there were old stories folks barely mentioned anymore. They called this thing Old Mossback, like some kind of local legend passed down quietly. From what Harriet said, it was known to be elusive. She swore it kept its distance most of the time and rarely caused trouble. But there were whispers about missing travelers and abandoned campsites that nobody could explain. She said people just learned to stay clear of certain areas, and life went on. Harriet looked me straight in the eye and told me to be careful, not to go looking for it again. She said it never ends well for those who try to chase a mystery that's better left alone. Naturally, I wanted answers. Some of us, a small group who heard my story, decided to head back out there. We took flashlights, a few tools, anything that might help us if we ran into something unexpected. We went before sunset, sticking together, calling out quietly, and trying to retrace my steps. The woods felt heavy again, but we didn't find the campsite remains, not in the same state anyway. I remember one guy picked up what looked like a torn piece of cloth that might have been from the clothing I saw. But that was it. No real clues, no sign of the creature. We stood around, whispering about what it could have been. One person suggested maybe it was just a misidentified animal. Another said maybe it was a hoax and someone had staged the campsite scene to scare people. But I knew what I saw. I can't make anyone believe me if they don't want to. But I felt that presence, heard that sound, saw those eyes. As the evening deepened, we all started feeling uneasy. The woods began to feel like a closed room with no exit. Every little noise made us jump. After a while, we decided we'd had enough. Nobody wanted to push their luck. We headed back, more confused than when we started. On the way, we hardly spoke. It felt like the forest had swallowed our voices. In the weeks after that, Cedar Grove got quiet about the whole thing. People went back to their routines, but there was a subtle shift. Folks avoided going too deep into the woods alone. Some hunters stuck to well-known trails or stopped hunting altogether that season. Families reminded their kids not to wander off. The sheriff never found any solid proof and eventually shrugged it off. He hinted maybe I had seen a bear standing awkwardly or that I'd been spooked by some prankster, but I know that's not the truth. I can't forget how deliberate that creature's stare was, how it seemed more curious than afraid, how it sized me up. There was intelligence there, not just wild instinct. And those scattered belongings, who did they belong to? Why were they in such a state? I never heard of anyone reporting missing friends or family around that exact time, at least not officially. Maybe people just didn't connect the dots, or maybe some travelers simply never made it back home and no one knew where they had gone. Over time, I stopped talking about it much. Most people either didn't believe me or didn't want to get involved. But I still think about it. It's been so many years, and I can still see that shape in my memory. The way it vanished into the foliage, the way the undergrowth seemed to swallow it without a sound. I still feel that chill sometimes when I recall how quiet the woods became. It's like nature itself was holding its breath. I never got any real closure. The creature never showed up again, at least not to me. Life went on, but I can't shake the feeling that Cedar Grove's forests hold something more than just the usual wildlife. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't just an overactive imagination. To this day, I don't have a neat explanation. Sometimes things just happen, and then they're gone, leaving behind a lot of uneasy questions. That's all I've got. Just this memory, still as sharp and unsettling as when it happened. Story 5. I remember that morning in 2015 like it was yesterday. I was working as a park ranger near Redwood Falls, Washington, going about what should have been a normal day. It was early spring, right after most of the snow had melted, and I'd set out to check a few remote trails, some old wooden bridges, and a couple of camping areas that rarely saw foot traffic. I liked mornings out there because the forest was usually quiet. You'd hear birds, small critters rustling around, and the occasional distant creek flowing. It usually felt peaceful, but that day was just off. I'd been out for maybe an hour, carrying my usual gear: water, radio, binoculars, a small first aid kit, and a notepad for making notes on any damage to signs or bridges. I headed toward a spot I rarely visited. It was a narrow trail that connected to a rickety old bridge. The bridge itself wasn't exactly closed off, but we didn't encourage visitors to cross it since it needed repairs. As I got closer, I noticed the forest felt different. The birds seemed quieter, like they were more spread out, calling from a distance rather than the canopy overhead. I remember thinking maybe I'd accidentally spooked them. When I reached the bridge, something else caught my attention. On the ground near the trail were scattered items that didn't belong there: a couple of backpacks, some torn-up camping gear, a mess of utensils, just random stuff scattered around out of place. There were no obvious signs of blood or violence, but it looked like someone's camp had been raided or hurriedly abandoned. I stood there a moment, leaning slightly over one of the backpacks. It looked weathered, but not like it had been out there for weeks. More like someone had set it down the day before and never came back. The whole thing made me uneasy. There was this smell, too, like damp fur and stale sweat hanging in the air. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Bears sometimes rummage through campsites, but this didn't look like a bear's work. The stuff wasn't ripped apart, just scattered oddly. I started scanning the area with my binoculars, peering through the thick undergrowth. That's when I heard something that I still can't fully describe. It was a low, resonant grunt or moan, coming from somewhere off to my left. It wasn't a bear, not a cougar, and definitely not a human voice. It was too deep and too... I don't know, it had this odd vibration to it. My heart jumped, and I immediately tucked my binoculars under my arm, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. I took a few careful steps into the brush, moving slowly, trying not to snap too many twigs. The air felt heavier. I could sense I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I have to admit, I felt exposed. Trees were crowded together, making it hard to see more than a few yards in. Suddenly, I saw a large, dark shape through a gap in the foliage. At first, I thought it might be a person in a full-body suit or heavy outdoor clothing, someone who got lost or was trying to scare me. But this figure was tall, easily taller than any man I'd encountered out there, and it was covered in dark, matted hair. Not a bear standing up. This was something else, something with a broader, more human-like silhouette. My stomach clenched. I could see it move slightly, shifting its weight from one leg to another, and as it did, a bit of sunlight broke through the canopy and caught its face. Its eyes, I still remember them. They were dark but reflective, intense, and locked right on me. It knew I was there, just as I knew it was there. I couldn't make out every detail. It was partially obscured by leaves, but the impression was clear. This thing was bipedal, large, muscular, and very much aware that I'd found its territory. I couldn't help it. My legs felt shaky. I actually considered calling out, asking if someone was messing with me, but something in me knew that would be a mistake. Instead, I slowly brought my binoculars up again, as quietly as I could, to get a better look. The movement made the figure tense up. I think it saw the glint of the lenses because it immediately let out another sound, a heavy, gruff exhale that sounded more like a warning than anything else. At that point, my mind was racing. I've heard stories. People talk about strange sightings in these woods, something like a big, hairy humanoid creature. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I never believed them. I mean, I'd heard the jokes, the old legends, but I'm a practical guy. I know these forests well. But right then, I couldn't deny that I was staring at something that shouldn't exist. It was there, not 50 feet away, staring back at me. I slowly backed up, trying not to make sudden movements. My boots felt heavy, and every twig that cracked under my foot sounded like a gunshot to me. I made it back toward the bridge, all the while feeling that thing's gaze burning into me. Once I hit the clearing near the bridge, I fumbled for my radio. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely catch my breath. I made some stupid comment over the radio, something like a dumb joke to my colleagues, trying to keep it light. But my voice shook, and I could tell they picked up on it. They asked if everything was fine. I just said I was checking something out, that I'd gotten spooked by a bear or something. I didn't want to sound insane. After I clicked off the radio, I stood there for a few long seconds, listening. The forest had gone quiet again. I couldn't see the creature anymore, but I could feel its presence. It was like standing just outside someone's home and knowing they were watching from behind a curtain. I didn't see it move off, didn't hear it walk away, but I knew I needed to leave. I followed the trail back out, keeping my eyes on the brush. Every sound made me jump. A squirrel darting up a tree, the wind pushing some branches, even my own footsteps echoing in my head. When I finally got back to a main path, the relief was almost overwhelming. I was sweating, and my hands trembled. I looked around, making sure no one was around to see me looking like I'd just encountered a ghost. I knew I had to tell someone. Later that day, I spoke to my supervisor, just giving the facts. Strange, scattered gear, weird sounds, and a large, unidentified figure in the woods that looked nothing like a known animal. I didn't say Bigfoot outright, but I described what I saw. He listened quietly, and though he didn't outright call me crazy, I could see that skeptical look in his eye. Still, he knew me. I wasn't the type to invent nonsense. Some of my colleagues kind of glanced at each other, not sure what to think. No one laughed, though. I think they sensed how rattled I was. I never found out what happened to those backpacks or who left them there. There were no missing person reports that matched, no calls from worried campers. Just a weird, silent mystery. For a while I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person in a ghillie suit pulling some kind of prank. But the size, the eyes, the sound it made. I can't shake it. And the smell, too. There's no forgetting that damp, musky odor. I know the local legends. People say they've seen strange silhouettes peeking from behind trees. Some claim they've heard footsteps pacing around their tents at night. I always thought it was just talk. Now I'm not so sure. After that day, I stuck to more traveled areas. I carried on with my job, of course, but I never went back to that exact spot alone. The forest out there is vast, and there are places we still don't fully understand. Whenever I think back, I get the same uneasy feeling. It never chased me, never attacked, never did anything other than stare me down. Yet that was enough to leave me feeling small, fragile, and out of my depth. I've never seen it again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving quietly through the trees, watching anyone who dares venture too far off the beaten path. I wish I had a proper explanation. I wish I could say I found tracks that day or got a clear photograph. But I didn't. All I have are the memories of that single morning and the uneasy feeling that something in those woods was as real as I am, something we can't neatly classify. I guess I'll never know what it really was. It happened, it ended, and the forest went right back to normal, like nothing ever took place. Yet I can't forget, and I still don't know what to make of it. Story 6. Back in the summer of 1995, I was staying in Radcliffe Springs, Pennsylvania, and I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was me, Rodri, who we all called Rhodey, Finley, and Jolene. We were all around the same age, late teens, bored out of our minds, and eager to find something different to do. Rhodey had heard about an old abandoned train station hidden somewhere in the thick woods just outside town. It wasn't exactly a secret, some people knew about it, but it wasn't on any map you could easily find. We were drawn to it, half expecting to find nothing more than rotten planks and rusty rails, something we could shrug off as just another piece of old Americana fading into the forest. That morning, after a short drive, we parked near a patch of trees and followed a barely noticeable trail deeper into the woods. I remember how quiet it was. The only sounds were our own footsteps, snapping twigs, and the distant chirping of birds. After maybe half an hour, we saw what looked like part of a platform poking through the greenery. The station itself was swallowed up by nature. Thick vines wrapped around old beams, moss carpeted the floor, and small ferns grew out of cracks in the stone. The metal tracks were barely visible, as if the earth had decided to pull them back underground. As we stepped onto the old platform, we noticed something odd. Scattered around were personal items, things like a single muddy boot, half of a torn backpack strap, a broken flashlight with its lens cracked and rusted. It felt off. Nobody said it out loud, but I know we were all thinking the same thing. Why would anyone leave this stuff behind? We stuck close together as we moved along, shining the cheap flashlights we'd brought. The air felt heavy in my lungs, and there was a weird tension, like the silence wasn't natural. Every few seconds, a subtle gust would push through the leaves overhead, and the wind produced this strange, low, whooshing sound. It didn't sound like normal wind rustling leaves. It sounded deeper, more hollow. We didn't want to scare each other by mentioning anything grim, so we kept it light at first. Rhodey tried cracking a joke about the place being a hipster hangout before it was cool, but his voice came out shaky, and Jolene just shook her head, looking uneasy. Finley kept looking around like he was expecting something to jump out at any moment. I tried to brush it off, but even I could feel something was wrong. The place had this atmosphere, like it was trying to warn us to leave. We decided to explore a bit more, stepping inside the gutted remains of the station's waiting area. Old benches were broken, graffiti smeared across moldy walls, and the floor was uneven from tree roots pushing up through the foundation. The scent of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. At one point, as we were moving deeper into the darker recesses of the station, Finley grabbed my sleeve and pointed to the far corner of the room. I followed his flashlight beam and caught a glimpse of something I can barely explain. It looked like a huge, shaggy silhouette, taller than any person I knew, with broad shoulders and a head that grazed a rotted crossbeam. I only saw it for maybe half a second before it slipped behind a column and vanished. I'm not even sure if the others got as clear a look as I did, but Finley's grip on my sleeve tightened, and Jolene's breathing got audibly heavier. We just stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen, or thought we'd seen. Rhodey tried to keep us calm, but I could tell he was rattled, his flashlight beam shaking on the station's old tiles. It's hard to describe the fear that was building inside me. It wasn't just that we saw something big and strange, it was how it made the entire place feel suddenly hostile. The silence now felt predatory. I felt like we were being watched from all angles. Every old post, every patch of darkness could be hiding something enormous and dangerous. We backed out the way we came, our steps slow and careful. Once outside, I remember the relief of the open air, but it didn't last long. We had left behind those scattered belongings and that odd silhouette, but the feeling of being watched followed us. Jolene pointed out fresh marks on the ground, deep impressions in the moist soil, sort of like footprints but elongated, with a strange pattern I've never seen before. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight to inspect them. They weren't bear prints, and they sure weren't human. They were too big, and you could make out something that looked like toes. I remember my stomach dropping. I kept telling myself I should know what animal leaves tracks like that, but I didn't. None of us did. That's when we heard the sound that will probably never leave my memory. It was a low, rumbling noise, like a deep grunt or a growl, echoing through the empty structure behind us. It sounded angry, or at least territorial. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my neck. Rhodey whispered something like, "We should go," and none of us argued. We just moved, sticking close, scanning the tree line, the underbrush, the old tracks being reclaimed by the forest. At any moment, I expected to see something burst out from between the trees. We all did. There was a strange tension in the air as we made our way back into the forest, trying to retrace our steps. We stumbled, got tangled in thorny bushes, and almost lost our sense of direction. At one point, Finley turned around suddenly and flashed his light behind us. I followed his gaze, and for a split second thought I saw a large shape move behind a wide birch tree. But when I focused, it was gone, or maybe it had never really been there. That's how the rest of our retreat felt. Glimpses, noises, heavy breathing, and the uncomfortable feeling that we were leaving something behind that we'd never truly understand. Once we got back to the edge of the woods and the car was finally in sight, it felt like we'd just escaped a bad dream. Nobody spoke until we were on the road heading home. It was only back at Rhodey's place late that afternoon that Finley remembered he had his grandfather's old journal stored away. He said his grandfather had mentioned something about these woods a long time ago. We huddled in a dusty corner of the attic, flipping through pages that smelled like mildew, our nerves still on edge. We found references to a place called Sleeping Hollow, somewhere near that old station, tied to stories about large, elusive, primate-like creatures that were rumored to patrol the forests. No tragic stories, no dramatic warnings, just vague hints and careful suggestions that something big and ancient lingered out there. We didn't feel like heroes. We felt small and stupid. We had gone out there expecting an adventure, a cool story to tell, and instead we'd stumbled into something that didn't want us around. Back downstairs, we tried to ask a few older neighbors what they knew. Most laughed it off or changed the subject quickly. One elderly man, his voice barely above a whisper, said he'd heard rumors about something with huge feet seen around abandoned places in the area, but he offered no details. No validation, just a nervous chuckle and a dismissive wave. It wasn't much, but it hinted that we weren't the first to have this experience. By the time I got home that evening, the sun was going down. I remember lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing. I kept replaying that half-second glimpse of the dark, hairy shape in the station's corner, the weird footprints, and that awful, rumbling sound. It felt like the forest had a secret, something that emerged when no one else was around, something that might have been watching us long before we ever got close to that old station. I'm older now, and I've never been able to fully explain what happened. We never went back to that abandoned station. I still think about it sometimes, and that uneasy feeling creeps in, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. Whatever we saw, or thought we saw, left a mark on me. I don't know if it was really a Bigfoot or something else entirely. All I know is what I felt, that unmistakable sensation that we had stepped into a territory that wasn't ours, that we'd come face to face, if only for an instant, with something that was never meant to be found. And after that day in 1995, I never looked at those woods the same way again. That single afternoon still lingers in my mind, a constant reminder that the world can hold secrets that don't fit neatly into what we think we know. Sometimes I can almost smell that damp moss and feel the weight of that silence, and I still get chills. To this day, I have no real explanation for what we encountered, but I know what I felt, and that's enough to keep me wondering. Story 7. I still remember the exact feeling of that afternoon in 2007 out near Mountain View, Arkansas. It was supposed to be a casual day off. Back then, my free time often led me to all sorts of rural backroads, scouting around for old junk that I might turn into strange clocks or add to my odd collection of antique alarm clocks. Sometimes I'd take a friend along, and that day it was Eddie who decided to tag along. Our plan was simple. We'd drive out of town, poke around some old barns or flea markets if we found any, and head home before dark. But things never go exactly as planned. My car, an old squeaky sedan that had seen better days, started making a knocking sound about an hour into the trip. The engine sputtered, and before I knew it, we were stuck on a narrow, dusty road flanked by tall trees. There wasn't much of a shoulder, and there sure as hell wasn't any cell reception. After popping the hood and realizing neither of us had a clue what we were looking at, we decided our best bet was to walk back toward where we'd last seen a farmhouse, or at least some sign of civilization. We started walking along this dirt trail that cut deeper into the trees. The sun was low, those last few hours of daylight stretching the shadows, and something about the place felt off. I've been in plenty of wooded areas, some darker, some way more isolated, but this felt different. There was this hush. No birds, no rustling of small critters, just the crunch of our feet on the dirt and the distant creaking of branches. We hadn't gone too far before Eddie pointed out these footprints in the mud. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boot print and much wider. At first I thought maybe it was some trick of erosion or weird tire tracks, but they were clearly shaped like large, heavy footprints. There were no claw marks like a bear might leave, and the spacing of the steps suggested something that walked upright. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone was playing a prank, or it was some strange boot designed for logging work. Still, my heart was already thumping. We kept going, a bit faster now, not talking much. The silence was getting under my skin. It's like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling sound, almost like a deep growl, but more distant, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate in my chest, making my stomach clench. Eddie heard it too. I could see his shoulders tense up. We had these small flashlights, cheap plastic ones, but at that moment they felt as comforting as a child's toy sword. We both flicked them on and aimed them at the dark tree line. We didn't see anything at first, just more trees and underbrush. Then something huge moved. Just a quick, shadowy silhouette drifting between trunks. It was tall, much taller than me or Eddie, covered in dark, matted hair. I couldn't make out a face, just a hulking figure. It moved smoothly, almost soundlessly, except for this faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under its weight. Before that day, I might have laughed off any story about Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it. But seeing that shape out there, I couldn't laugh. I was too damn scared. I remember whispering something to Eddie, or maybe just cursing under my breath, I'm not sure. My mouth was dry. We decided to backtrack. We turned around and started walking as fast as we could without outright sprinting. The sound came again, a deep, guttural noise that made my neck hairs stand on end. Every step I took, I expected to feel something grab me. Every crack of a twig behind us felt like it was right on our heels. We didn't know where we were going, just that going forward seemed like a bad idea. After about 15 or 20 minutes, we spotted a light through the trees, a cabin, an old wooden structure that looked like it might have been a hunting shack. Desperate, we scrambled over to it and knocked hard on the door. I half expected an empty building or some grumpy old-timer telling us to get lost. Instead, a guy opened up, middle-aged, rough around the edges, looked like he knew his way around a rifle and the woods. He introduced himself as Roy, but I barely caught his name at first because I was talking way too fast, trying to explain what we'd seen. I think I said something like, "There's something out there, huge, hairy, I don't know what the hell it is." Eddie chimed in, talking about the footprints. Roy looked at us, eyes narrowing, but he didn't laugh. He didn't even smirk. He just nodded like he knew exactly what we meant. He let us in, locked the door behind us, and went about lighting a lantern and setting an old lantern flashlight on the table. The cabin smelled like old tobacco and wet boots, and there were animal pelts on the walls. It felt safer than outside, but not by much. I couldn't help thinking that whatever was out there could probably tear through these old wooden planks if it really wanted to. Roy started telling us in his slow, steady voice that he'd noticed strange signs too. Big branches snapped high up, far higher than a normal human could reach. Weird impressions in the ground. The woods had been quieter than usual lately, and local wildlife seemed to be on edge. He hadn't seen it himself, not clearly, but he believed us. He didn't know what it was, maybe a feral man, maybe some undiscovered species, but he knew it was best to be cautious. He prepared a high-frequency whistle and a heavy-duty flashlight. He told us, if we heard it outside, to stay calm, not run out screaming. Just be ready. I remember sitting there, my heart still racing, Eddie looking pale, Roy calm as a stone. The cabin walls were thin, and every sound outside, branches rubbing together, distant creaks, made me flinch. We all listened, barely speaking. The tension was thick, like I was waiting for a door to burst open. For hours, I stayed alert, ears straining. At some point, I realized the night had gotten very quiet again. No footsteps, no low growls. Nothing, just the distant rustle of leaves when a faint breeze moved through. I kept expecting something to happen, a window shattering, a massive shape pressing up against the door. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over. We never truly slept, just dozed lightly. By the time the sky began to brighten, we still hadn't heard or seen anything more. It was as if whatever had been stalking us had decided we weren't worth the trouble, or had moved on to some deeper part of the forest. In the early morning light, we gathered our courage and stepped outside. Everything looked normal. No giant footprints right around the cabin, no monstrous silhouettes in the woods. Roy offered to guide us toward a more traveled road where we could find help. We thanked him. Eddie and I were just glad to be out of that place without any extra scars to show for it. A short walk back brought us to a main dirt road that led us to a local gas station where we eventually got a tow truck. The mechanic didn't ask too many questions, and we didn't volunteer much either. We just fixed the car and drove home. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, some kind of black bear standing upright. But I know what bears look like, and the shape I saw was different, taller, the proportions not quite right. Maybe it was a person in a suit, but who the hell would be out there in the middle of nowhere, pulling that kind of stunt at dusk? And the footprints, those still haunt me. They were too damn large and too well-defined. The way it moved was unnatural for a person. Something about it felt not human. After I got home, I looked at my odd collection of alarm clocks piled on a shelf in my workshop. They looked so ordinary, so harmless. I realized then that just a few hours before, I'd been happily messing around with mechanical gears and tiny screws, clueless about what was lurking in those woods. Now, the world felt bigger, stranger. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into neat little boxes. The memory still sends a chill down my spine. Sometimes I lie awake at night, thinking about the way it moved through those trees, watching us, deciding whether to approach or retreat. I have no proof, no photos, no recordings. Just these memories, this lingering anxiety in my gut when I think about that shadowy figure. Every now and then, when I see a report or read something about strange encounters in remote areas, I get that same uneasy feeling. I guess I'll never know what was out there in those Arkansas woods. But I know it was real. I felt it. I saw it. And I still don't have any good explanation for it all these years later. Story 8. I remember this happening in 2010 in Charleston, South Carolina. It's something I still can't fully explain, and when I think back on it, my stomach knots up. That day started out normal enough. I was working at the tiny bookstore where I spent most of my time. It was quiet, just me, a couple of customers browsing old paperbacks, and the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Late that afternoon, Mila dropped by. She was an old friend, an independent photographer who was always chasing after weird stuff to capture on film. She seemed excited, a little too excited actually, and told me she'd found this old abandoned building near the port. She was convinced there could be something special inside, maybe some rare kind of bird nesting or something unusual she could photograph. She knew I'd been bored out of my mind lately, so she invited me along. I'm not really the adventurous type, but I liked Mila's energy, and the thought of maybe spotting some interesting seabirds or something offbeat made me say yes. We got to the place close to dusk. Charleston's harbor area can feel a bit eerie when the light's fading, and that building didn't help. It was some old warehouse near the docks, just a big, grimy structure with busted windows, rusted metal everywhere, and a weird silence around it. I mean, the rest of the city wasn't too far off, but it felt like we were stepping into another world, a dead, hollow place. I could taste the salt in the air, feel the dampness clinging to my clothes. The ground was littered with cracked wood, old cables and piles of junk that looked like they'd been rotting for years. Mila had her camera out right away. I remember she fiddled with the lens, trying to get the right exposure in the dim light. Meanwhile, I just stood there, shining my flashlight around and feeling uneasy. The air inside that building felt heavier than outside. There was this thick, stale smell, like old wet cardboard, and something else I couldn't put my finger on. As we moved in deeper, stepping over boxes and broken pieces of metal, something felt off. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone. Mila was focused on her camera, snapping shots of shadows and strange graffiti marks on the walls, but I kept looking around, shining my flashlight into every corner. There were weird marks on the floors, long scuff marks, like something heavy had been dragged, and a few random belongings were scattered around, a single old boot, a torn piece of cloth, some crushed cans. It didn't scream crime scene or anything, but it felt wrong, like we'd walked into a place someone or something didn't want us in. Just when I was about to suggest we leave, I heard it. This deep, rumbling sound that cut through the silence. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't machinery, it wasn't anything I'd ever heard in a city setting. It sounded like a growl, low and resonant, almost vibrating in my chest. Mila stopped taking photos and looked at me, eyes wide. I could see she was spooked too. I raised my flashlight and aimed it toward where the sound had come from, an open doorway leading into a darker section of the building. That's when we saw it. For just a second, the beam of my flashlight caught a figure towering at the end of the hallway. It was huge, way taller than any normal person, and covered in dark, matted hair. Not like a homeless person wrapped in blankets. This was full-body hair, thick and shaggy. Its face was mostly in shadow, but I swear I saw these glinting eyes reflecting the light back at me. The thing stood there, silent now, just watching us. Then, before I could even steady my hand, it moved. It shifted back into the darkness so smoothly, it almost looked unreal. I was frozen. Every hair on my arm stood on end, and I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. Mila grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to go." I don't think we even spoke after that. We just turned and headed straight out the way we came in, stumbling over junk on the floor, breath echoing in the silence. Outside, the sky was darker. The streetlights along the nearby road looked distant and weak. We rushed out to her car, jumped in, and just sat there for a moment trying to catch our breath. I don't know what the hell that thing was, but it wasn't some normal animal. It was too large, and it moved too quietly. The way it looked back at us felt almost aware. Mila seemed freaked out, but also determined. She mumbled something like, "We need to talk to Clyde." Clyde was a local guy, a sort of amateur researcher who collected stories about odd sightings in the area. He was known for digging into local legends, everything from phantom ships to weird creatures rumored to live in the marshes. I wasn't thrilled about going to see him, especially not at night, but I was rattled. I wanted answers. So we headed over to his small house near the older part of town. Clyde looked surprised to see us show up after dark, and when we told him what happened, he got quiet. He listened closely, nodding along, and finally said he'd heard rumors of strange primate-like creatures lurking around old dockside buildings. Mostly whispers, no proof, just the occasional mention of hairy figures slipping into alleyways or hanging around abandoned structures late at night. He said people often dismissed these stories as drunks or homeless people wrapped in blankets, but Clyde never fully believed the dismissals. Now, with our encounter, he wanted to see for himself. This is where I should have gone home. But I was still running on adrenaline, and I think I wanted confirmation. So we actually went back that very night, this time with Clyde in tow. Before heading back, he grabbed a better flashlight, some old recording device, and a big crowbar just in case. My stomach was in knots as we approached that building again. The silence outside felt even heavier now. We stepped back inside, careful not to make too much noise, Clyde leading the way with his bright flashlight. The place looked the same, but everything felt more sinister. I checked over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting that thing to leap out at us. We moved slowly through the corridors, pausing to look at strange footprints in the dust. These weren't normal footprints. They were large, bigger than any I'd ever seen, maybe twice the size of my own foot, and kind of elongated, like a human foot, but off. In one corner, we found a piece of twisted cable, as if something strong had grabbed it and bent it without effort. I could feel my heart thumping in my ears. The weird thing is, we never saw it again that night. No more growls, no more glimpses of huge, hairy silhouettes. But we all felt it was there, watching. Mila tried snapping more photos, but every time she looked at her camera's preview, it was just darkness and grainy shapes. Clyde tried using his recorder, but all we got was this strange static. It was frustrating and terrifying at the same time, like we were standing in the middle of something massive and unknown, but couldn't pin it down. After about an hour of searching, nerves frayed, we decided to bail. There was no point risking our safety. Even Clyde, who was always eager for a good mystery, looked uneasy. I remember stepping out into the cool night air and feeling relieved, yet unsatisfied. We had no solid proof. None of us could say what it was for sure. Mila looked shaken, hugging her camera to her chest. Clyde muttered something about old local legends and how these creatures might just prefer to remain hidden. He'd heard stories from old dock workers. Some swore they saw weird ape-like shapes lurking around empty ships, but no one ever got close. We parted ways not long after, each of us subdued and quiet. I went back to my small apartment, laid awake in bed, and replayed the night in my head. I couldn't shake the image of that tall, hairy figure and the way it stared at us in that hallway. It wasn't just a shape. It felt like it was sizing us up, deciding what to do. The idea that something that big and that strange was lurking so close to the heart of Charleston made me feel small and vulnerable. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. None of us do. Mila tried enhancing her photos later, but got nothing definitive, just blurry corners and strange shadows. Clyde dug through old files and local stories, but never found anything conclusive. I went back to my normal life at the bookstore, but for weeks I couldn't stop flinching at sounds after dark or peering out the back door if I thought I heard a shuffle in the alley. Eventually, life moved on. Charleston went on being Charleston, but I never looked at the old, abandoned places around the port the same way again. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there. Sometimes I wonder what it wanted. I guess there's no neat ending. Nothing dramatic happened after that night. No big revelations or breaking news stories. We just had that one terrifying encounter, saw something that shouldn't exist, that didn't fit any category. And then, just like that, life went on. But I still remember every detail, and it still sends a chill down my spine. I have no explanation, and maybe I never will. Story 9. I know this might sound a bit out there, but I still remember that day in late September 2004 in Brook Haven, Pennsylvania, like it happened yesterday. I was a freelance photographer back then, always hunting for unusual spots to shoot. My friend Mark had this idea of exploring an old, abandoned train station deep in the nearby woods. He'd heard about it from someone else, and he thought it might give us some unique photos. It wasn't on any map I knew, but Mark was pretty confident in his directions. I trusted him. I wish I could say I regret it, but I'm still not sure what to make of that day. We set out early in the morning, backpacks on, camera gear secured, and followed a dirt trail into the forest. At first, it was just a normal walk, the crunch of leaves under our boots, that damp smell of earth and moss, the occasional rustle of birds overhead. But about halfway in, I noticed something strange. The birds stopped making noise, like entirely. It was so sudden that I remember pausing and looking around, trying to spot a predator or something that might have scared them off. But I saw nothing, just trees, thick undergrowth, and a lot of silence. Mark picked up on it too. We glanced at each other, both sort of shrugging at first, trying to brush it off. But the silence was heavy, and my heart started thumping a bit harder. I tightened my grip on my camera, feeling this weird tension I couldn't explain. We pressed on, hoping that maybe it was just a weird moment, maybe a hawk overhead or something else natural that I just wasn't seeing. A little further along, we started noticing random items off to the sides of the trail, like abandoned backpacks, some old clothing, a pair of hiking boots left behind. They looked like they'd been there a long time. There was no blood or anything gruesome, but the way they were just scattered around made me feel uneasy. It wasn't like someone carefully placed them there. They were just tossed about. I remember Mark running his fingers over a dusty backpack strap, and the thing practically crumbled at his touch. It was old, weathered by rain and sun, but why would anyone just leave their stuff here? It didn't feel right. We kept moving, trying not to think too much about it. The forest got denser and the undergrowth thicker. I remember the air feeling heavier, like the humidity shot up or something. Every step we took sounded louder than it should have, like the forest had swallowed all other noises and only allowed us to hear our own movements. Then we reached the old train station. It was exactly how Mark described it. A small, crumbling structure, wrapped in thick vines of ivy, with rusted tracks barely visible in the undergrowth. The wooden platform was sagging in places, and old signs were faded and unreadable. Inside, the walls were peeling, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust and leaves. I raised my camera, focusing on the soft light that filtered through broken windows. It was eerie but visually interesting. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound echoing from somewhere deeper inside the station. It wasn't a growl exactly. It was more like a deep grunt, a rumble that sent a vibration through my chest. I froze, heart pounding. Mark stiffened beside me. We stood there, listening. Nothing for a moment. Then the noise came again, a little louder this time. I silently stepped forward, aiming my camera into one of the darker corners. I didn't see anything at first, just the shapes of broken beams and piles of debris. Before I could take another step, something caught my eye. On the dusty floor, near a collapsed doorframe, was a huge footprint. It was larger than any human foot I've ever seen, and the toes seemed off. They weren't shaped like a normal boot print or even a bare human footprint. I snapped a photo, my hand shaking. Mark stepped beside me and whispered something under his breath, but I couldn't make out what he said. We both knew something was wrong. We looked at each other, the kind of look where no words are needed. We were both thinking about the stories we'd heard, tales about strange creatures lurking in the deep woods. I never put much stock in that stuff, but I wasn't about to stand around and find out what made that sound. We decided it was time to leave, carefully and quietly. As we headed towards an exit, basically just an open space where a door used to be, we caught a glimpse of movement above us, through a window without glass. I only saw it for a split second, but I'll never forget that silhouette. It was tall, really tall. The shoulders were broad, and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair. The head moved smoothly as it slipped out of sight, like it was in complete control of its body weight. It made no heavy footsteps, nothing you'd expect from something that large, just this silent, smooth movement. Mark jerked back, eyes wide, and I think I stopped breathing for a second. My mind was racing, a bear walking on hind legs, some huge escaped primate. Or was it really one of those creatures people claim to see but never get proof of? We moved, not running, but walking quickly and quietly, trying not to rustle branches or kick stones. The whole station felt like it was holding its breath. My camera strap dug into my shoulder, and I realized I was sweating even though it wasn't that hot out. The walk back through the forest was pure tension. Every time a twig snapped under my foot, I flinched. Every dark shape between the trees looked like something watching us. At one point, I thought I heard soft steps behind us, but when I turned, nothing was there. We forced ourselves to stay calm and keep a steady pace. Running might trigger whatever it was to chase us. At least, that's what my gut told me. When we finally broke out of the denser forest and hit a more open, familiar trail, I allowed myself to breathe a bit. The silence that had taken over earlier started to ease. I could hear distant birds again, and even the faint hum of a car engine somewhere beyond the trees. It felt like we were stepping back into normal reality after being in some strange bubble. Back in town that afternoon, we told Jackson, an old friend of Mark's, what we'd encountered. He'd grown up in the area and knew a lot about local rumors. He just nodded thoughtfully, not calling us crazy or anything. Instead, he mentioned that he'd heard stories of a giant primate-like creature lurking in the more remote parts of these woods. He said people occasionally came across odd footprints or heard weird noises, but nobody had any solid proof. He'd never met anyone who actually saw the figure itself, and that's when I realized how unusual it was that we got even a glimpse. We felt uneasy admitting it, but we knew what we saw. Jackson suggested we talk to a local who'd been collecting stories about unexplained creatures around Pennsylvania. This guy, Franklin, had spent years gathering dusty notebooks and old newspaper clippings. Later that same day, still shaken, we visited him, curious to understand what we'd experienced. Franklin's place smelled like old paper and coffee. He showed us faded documents, scribbled anecdotes from the 1970s and 80s, hikers who reported seeing enormous footprints, hunters who swore they heard human-like calls in the night, even an old picture of what looked like twisted tree structures out in the woods that some believed these creatures built. None of it proved anything. It was all just enough to make us realize we weren't the first, but we had nothing concrete either. Just that one snapshot of the giant footprint inside the station and my memory of that tall, hairy silhouette. Franklin said that these encounters come in waves and then vanish, like the creature knows how to keep itself hidden. It's been around long before we ever settled in these parts, he claimed, and it will be around long after we're gone. I remember leaving Franklin's place that evening feeling unsettled and oddly small. We didn't have an explanation, just more questions. Back at my apartment, I looked through the photos I'd taken that day. The footprint image was there, but not as crisp as I'd have hoped. In the low light and my shaky hands, the detail was fuzzy. To anyone else, it might just look like a smudge in the dust. The silhouette we saw was never captured on camera. It existed only in my mind and in Mark's stunned expression. For weeks after, I kept expecting some resolution, maybe a newspaper story or a hiker's footage of something similar. But nothing came. It's been years, and to this day, I can't say for certain what we encountered out there. Some people who've heard my story think I'm exaggerating or mistaking a bear. Others say I probably stumbled into a hoax or a homeless person living off the grid. But I know what a person looks like, and I know the shape and movement I saw was not human. And I've seen bears. This was no bear. It moved too gracefully, too intelligently, and that footprint was unmistakable. I'm not looking for explanations anymore, to be honest. The forest doesn't owe me one. What we experienced that day in 2004 made me realize that maybe there are things out there living right alongside us, just out of sight. Creatures we dismiss as myths because we want our world to be neat and explainable. I never found that old station again, and I haven't tried. The woods have grown thicker, and I'm not sure I could find that exact spot even if I wanted to. Part of me thinks that's for the best. Every now and then, I'll meet someone who's heard whisperings about something strange in those woods near Brook Haven. I'll feel a chill down my spine when they mention it. But there's never a concrete conclusion, never a big reveal. Just silence, old footprints, and a shape that disappears before you can understand what you're really looking at. That's all I've got. And it still gives me the creeps. It still makes me think twice before wandering too deep off the trail with my camera. You never know what might be watching. Story 10. I remember the day so vividly, even though it's been years. It was sometime in the fall of 2012, a few months after my girlfriend and I moved into that cabin near Pine Creek in West Virginia. We'd come from a busier life, a marketing job in a larger city, constant noise, crowded streets. We moved out here for the quiet and the green of the Appalachian Hills, and at first, that's exactly what we got. Tranquility, crisp morning air, the subtle smell of pine drifting in through our windows. But on that day, something about the forest felt different from the moment I stepped outside. It started early in the morning. I'd gone out behind the cabin to chop some wood and check the ground near the creek that ran not too far from our place. The soil was moist, and I noticed these deep impressions, way bigger than any footprints I'd expect to see out there. I'm talking enormous, like something with a foot twice the size of mine had passed through. At first, I tried to reason it out. Maybe a bear, maybe a weird erosion pattern. But the shape looked so unmistakably like a huge bear footprint. It gave me this unsettling feeling in my stomach, like I'd just seen something I shouldn't have. My girlfriend was inside making coffee when I came back in and told her. She just stared at me, not sure what to think. We had heard stories since moving to Pine Creek. There were always these murmurs from locals about something roaming the hills. They never gave it a name outright, but everyone knew what they were hinting at. Some giant hairy thing that most folks associated with folklore or late-night campfire tales. We never took it seriously, not until we started seeing odd signs ourselves, scratches on tree trunks too high for a bear, strange patterns of snapped branches, and that low, almost rumbling noise at dusk that we could never quite place. We decided to show these new footprints to Tom, a local guy who was into what he called cryptid research. He wasn't a scientist with fancy degrees, just a regular guy who had lived here all his life and collected stories. We'd met him a few weeks back when we stumbled upon these weird tracks for the first time and decided to ask around town. Tom's the one who told us other people had seen something similar over the years, always describing something ape-like, but bigger, smarter, and far more cautious. He never claimed to have proof, just stories and notes he'd kept. That afternoon we headed into town to find Tom. Pine Creek wasn't much, a couple of small shops, a gas station that also sold basic groceries, and a handful of old houses scattered around. We found him near the edge of town, sitting on his porch, going through some worn-out notebooks. I described the footprints in detail, the size, the depth, the odd way the toes seemed splayed out. Tom nodded, listened quietly, then suggested we try something we'd talked about before, setting up camera traps and mapping out where these footprints tended to appear. I felt both excited and uneasy. Excited because I wanted to know what we were dealing with. Uneasy because something about the idea of tracking this thing felt like stepping into territory we weren't invited into. Still, that afternoon we gathered our gear. 2 old trail cameras Tom had loaned us, a notepad for sketches, and a cheap GPS unit. My girlfriend and I hiked along the deer trails in the woods around our cabin, looking for a good spot to place the first camera. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I remember the air being still, like everything was waiting for something to happen. We found a spot near where I'd seen those footprints and set up the camera pointing toward a small clearing. The ground there was softer and often collected footprints and animal tracks after rain. The second camera we set higher up along a ridge that overlooked a narrow stream. Tom believed that any large creature would come through that area to drink. By the time we finished, the light was starting to fade. We planned to stick around, stay quiet and watch, just for a bit, to see if anything happened before we headed back. As dusk approached, that's when I heard it again. This low, rumbling sound, not exactly a growl, not exactly a moan, more like a deep, resonant grunt that carried through the trees. I remember my girlfriend's eyes going wide. She heard it too. We both froze, scanning the tree line, hearts pounding. Suddenly, I noticed a shape, a dark form moving between the trunks maybe 50 yards away. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, and bulky. I couldn't make out details, but the silhouette was clearly not a bear standing on its hind legs. It had a certain posture, a shape that reminded me of a massive, upright ape. It paused for a moment, and I swear I felt it looking straight at us. Then, without making any more noise, it slipped behind the brush and disappeared. We didn't chase after it. We didn't call out or try to get closer. We just stood there, breathing hard, trying to process what we'd just seen. Eventually, we gathered ourselves and decided it was best to get back to the cabin. My thoughts raced. If this was what people talked about, if this was the creature behind those footprints, then it was real. And it knew we were here. Back inside, after locking the doors and drawing the curtains, we tried to calm down. I made some tea, and we talked quietly. We knew Tom would want to hear about this tomorrow. For now, we just needed to sleep on it. But we weren't alone for long. Around 8 or 9 at night, there was a knock at the door, quiet but firm. This gave both of us a start. We weren't expecting anyone, especially at that hour. I peeked through the window and saw a man dressed in a dark jacket, clean cut, kind of official looking. When I opened the door, he introduced himself as Smith, just Smith, and said he was in town on some land management survey. At first, I assumed he might be from the local authorities or maybe a forest ranger, but something about him felt off. He asked if we'd noticed anything unusual in the area, particularly large animal tracks. He asked if we'd heard any strange noises or seen anything we couldn't explain. He was too direct, too pointed with his questions. I felt uneasy. We'd never mentioned to anyone besides Tom what was going on, and we'd only told Tom earlier that same day. How did this guy know to ask about it? We told him we were just settling in and hadn't seen much. He nodded slowly, looked around the inside of our cabin, his gaze lingering on the muddy boots by the door and the small camera box on the table. Then thanked us and said, if we ever had concerns about local wildlife, we could reach him through the local ranger's office. He left without giving us a card, a phone number, or any proof of who he really was. After he was gone, I was too wired to sleep. I sat near the window for a while, listening to the quiet outside. The forest was dark and still, but I had this intense feeling that something else was out there, both the creature we'd seen and now this Smith guy who seemed far too informed. It was as if we'd stumbled onto something that certain people wanted to keep quiet. I started wondering if there had been other sightings that the authorities knew about, something they'd never made public. Later that night, as we tried to relax, we heard a distant thump outside. Not close, but out there in the woods. Then silence. No howls, no grunts, just the distant snap of a branch and maybe some soft crunching leaves. Could have been a deer, could have been anything. But given what we had seen earlier, it took on a different meaning in our minds. Eventually we managed to fall asleep, though it was restless. By morning, it felt like the entire previous day had been some bizarre dream. Footprints, a towering figure in the twilight, and a stranger at our door, asking suspicious questions. I checked the cameras that afternoon, but something was off. One camera had been shifted slightly, as if bumped, and the other had no new images at all. The forest gave away no new secrets. It was as if nothing had ever happened, and that's the feeling that still gets under my skin. In the days and weeks after, we never got a clear answer. We never saw that creature so clearly again, just glimpses out of the corner of our eyes, odd tracks that seemed to appear and vanish. The stranger we knew as Smith left town as quietly as he'd arrived. Tom continued his research, but even he admitted he was hitting a wall. None of the older residents wanted to talk openly, and we realized this kind of thing had been whispered about for generations, always just out of reach. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there. It was no bear, and I've spent enough time outdoors to know the difference. Whatever it was, it wanted to remain hidden, and it was damn good at it. And what bothered me even more was the sense that someone else out there knew about it, had known for a long time, and didn't want us to shine too much light on the subject. I'm still living with that uncertainty. When I think back to that one particular day, finding those enormous footprints in the morning, seeing that towering silhouette at dusk, and then that strange man showing up at our door as if on cue, it gives me chills. Nothing outright terrible happened to us. We weren't attacked, no one was hurt, and the cabin remained our home for quite a while after. But that day marked a turning point in how I see these woods. They're not just peaceful hills full of deer and squirrels. Something else is out there, something big, quiet and smart. And the silence around it, the people who come and go without explanation, only deepen the mystery. I still don't know what we encountered, and maybe I never will. It was one of those moments that starts and ends without any grand conclusion, leaving you with nothing but questions and that uneasy feeling that the world is more complicated than we like to believe. The memory stays with me, sharp as ever. I learned to keep my eyes open and my mouth mostly shut, because out here, you're never really sure who's watching or what. Story 11. I remember it was early September 1997, near Maplewood, Vermont. The morning was chilly but clear, and I had just started my shift as a trail maintenance worker for the Green Mountain State Forest. I'd been assigned to inspect a lesser-used trail that day. This trail wasn't on the Maine maps tourists usually got. It was older, quieter, and had a reputation for being harder to navigate because it cut through a denser part of the woods. I packed a small canteen of water, a simple map, some tape markers, and a folding knife. Nothing too fancy, just the basics I always carried. Walking out there, it felt pretty normal at first. The forest floor was damp, like it always is in the fall, and the leaves were just starting to turn color. Usually you'd hear birds right around sunrise, but I noticed after a while how strangely quiet it was. It's not like it was dead silent, just less alive than I expected. No usual early morning calls from birds, no small rustles in the brush. It was as if everything decided to sleep in that day. I remember telling myself not to overthink it, that maybe I'd just come at a weird time. But the quiet got under my skin in a subtle way, like a feeling that something was off. After maybe an hour of slow hiking, stopping now and then to clear small branches or check a marker on a tree, I found these strange marks. They were on the trunks of a few old trees, deep scratches at a height I couldn't easily reach, and I'm not short. I'm about 6 feet, and these scratches were definitely above eye level, maybe around 7 or 8 feet up. I've seen bear scratches before. I've seen what deer can do by rubbing their antlers. But these were different, longer. More like someone had taken a set of thick claws and just raked them down the bark. It unsettled me, but I wasn't immediately scared, just confused. I made a mental note of it and kept going, though I felt this creeping tension in my shoulders. About half an hour deeper in, I found footprints. Let me be clear, these weren't boot prints, and they weren't something small like a raccoon or fox. They were big, bigger than my foot, and shaped oddly like a human foot, but with toes that seemed thicker and set wider apart. They pressed deep into the damp ground, leaving a clear shape. I crouched down, trying to gauge how fresh they might be. The soil was still soft from recent rains, so it could have been made hours before. I remember feeling a wave of discomfort wash over me. Something very large and heavy had walked through there, something not wearing shoes, something I couldn't easily explain away as just a big bear's hind foot. I've seen bear tracks. These weren't that. I followed the trail a bit further, heart thumping a little harder now. Every step I took sounded too loud in my ears because the forest was just so quiet. At some point, I heard a single snap of a branch, just one sharp crack. I froze. It wasn't close enough to see what caused it, but it was definitely close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees. The canopy was thick, letting in that kind of filtered light that makes it hard to see far ahead. Nothing moved. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening. There was no follow-up sound, no footsteps, just my pulse in my ears. I decided to keep moving, but more cautiously. A few minutes later, as I was pushing aside some foliage, I saw something through the leaves. It was standing still, partially hidden, but I could see enough to know it wasn't a bear, a deer, or a human dressed in some furry outfit. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen out there. It must have stood well over 7 feet. Its body was broad, covered in dark, matted hair. The face wasn't fully visible, just enough to tell it was something with a flatter face than a bear, but I couldn't make out details. It was just there, watching me, not moving, not making a sound. I swear, my heart nearly stopped. I felt this surge of adrenaline telling me to run, but at the same time, I knew if it was dangerous, Running might trigger it to chase me. I took 2 small, slow steps backward. I didn't want to make any sudden moves. As I did, it inclined its head slightly, like it was trying to get a better look at me. That simple motion terrified me more than if it had roared or charged. It wasn't behaving like a dumb animal. It was observing me. There was this heavy tension in the air. I could feel my breathing getting shallow, and my palms were clammy. I kept my eyes on it, trying to show I was no threat, or at least that I wasn't about to do something stupid. When I couldn't take the pressure anymore, I slowly turned, keeping it in my peripheral vision. I started retracing my steps. The trail behind me was pretty open, so I moved steadily, but not too fast. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds. I never heard it follow. I never heard it make another sound. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I reached a spot in the forest where more sunlight broke through, and the trees were spaced out enough that I felt less trapped. Eventually, I made it back to more familiar territory. The whole time, I kept expecting that thing to burst out behind me, to show itself again, but it never did. By the time I got back to the park's main area, my muscles were aching and I felt drained. I told my supervisor what I'd seen. He didn't laugh. He just listened quietly, nodded and said, "I've heard a few stories like that around here." That was it. No big revelation, no plan to investigate. Just a simple acknowledgement that I wasn't the first person to come back, rattled from that part of the forest. I spent the rest of the day feeling uneasy. After work, I replayed everything in my head. The quiet woods, the strange scratches, the huge footprints, that figure, tall, hairy, and so still. It never made a sound, never came closer, but the tension was real. I keep telling myself it could have been just some weird trick of the light, or a person in a ghillie suit playing a prank. But that doesn't fit with what I saw. That size, those tracks, and especially the way it tilted its head, all of it just felt too real, too unsettling. The following days, I avoided that trail. Honestly, I never went back there alone. Some other rangers mentioned hearing strange noises out there over the years, and a few claimed they'd seen big footprints or glimpses of something unusual. No one had concrete evidence, no photos, no clear prints cast in plaster, nothing that would convince a skeptic. But I know what I saw. I know the dread I felt. It changed the way I look at those forests. I realized we don't know everything that's out there. Most of the time, the woods are peaceful and predictable, but sometimes you stumble onto something you can't explain. I've never been able to shake that memory. Even all these years later, I still feel my chest tighten when I think about it. It didn't attack me. It didn't chase me. It just watched. It let me leave, as if it had no intention of harming me, or maybe it was just curious. I have no idea what it wanted, or what it really was, but something about that encounter still makes my skin crawl. After that day, I just stopped assuming I had the forest all figured out. I saw something that shouldn't exist, but I know it does, or at least it did that day, and that's all there is to tell. I have no grand conclusion, no neat explanation. It happened, and then it ended, just like that. I'm left with a memory I can't fully understand, but I know it was real. That's what I remember from September 1997 in those quiet old woods near Maplewood. It still gives me chills. Story 12. I still remember that weekend in May 2003 like it happened yesterday. I was a high school teacher back then, and the school had given us a long weekend off. I decided to head out to a remote part of the Chippewa National Forest near Clearbrook, Minnesota. I wanted total peace. No one around, no constant buzzing of phones. Just me, a decent book, and the natural sounds of the forest. At first, it seemed like the perfect escape. I found a spot near a small stream, just hidden enough that I felt like I was in my own tiny world. I pitched my tent, got my sleeping bag set up, and spent the afternoon reading, and occasionally looking up to watch the light shift through the leaves. Everything felt serene at first. The gentle sound of the stream trickling over stones was soothing, and the birds seemed comfortable enough with my presence that they sang without stopping. By late afternoon, the temperature started to drop a bit, and I made a simple meal on my small camp stove. I remember feeling completely at ease, like I had made the right choice to come here alone. But as the sun began dipping below the tree line, something changed. It was subtle at first. The typical chatter of insects I'd expect to hear around twilight just didn't start. I noticed it suddenly. The silence. It got quiet in a way that felt wrong. I mean, forests can be peaceful, but this was different. It was like someone had hit the mute button on every living thing around me. I felt a strange tension in the air, and my neck prickled as if I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor, coming from somewhere behind the dense brush to my right. They weren't close enough for me to see anything, but they were loud enough to rule out a small animal. Whatever was walking around out there was big. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it into the woods. All I could see were branches, dark trunks, and uneven patches of undergrowth. No eyeshine, no shape, nothing I could identify. I stood there for a few minutes, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The footsteps stopped as soon as I tried to look. The forest went dead silent again. It took some effort to calm my breathing. I decided not to panic. I'd heard stories of bears, and I knew I had to stay rational. I made some noise, knocked a stick against a tree, tried to make my presence known. Usually, bears or deer will just move on if they realize a human is around. But all I got was that eerie silence. Eventually, I retreated into my tent. I zipped myself in and sat there, shining my light around the inside, my back against my sleeping bag. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I tried to read a bit more to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. My heart was racing, and every small sound made me jump. Then, at some point in the night, couldn't have been too late because I still saw a hint of twilight, I heard this scratching noise. It was light at first, like something scraping the bark of a tree. Then it got a bit louder, more deliberate. It was happening on the tree just next to my tent. I can't explain the feeling of fear that washed over me. It wasn't just the noise. It was the sense that something tall and strong was standing right there, maybe only a few steps away. I reached for my flashlight again and slowly moved the zipper of the tent's door just enough to peek out. The beam caught something I still have trouble describing. There was this tall, broad shape covered in dark, matted hair. It was hunched, but even hunched over it seemed enormous, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was just standing there behind the trees, partially hidden by branches. I could see one of its arms reaching toward the trunk of the tree, long fingers curling against the bark. Its face was mostly in shadow, but I sensed eyes staring straight at me. The way it stood, almost too still, too aware, made my stomach twist. I froze. I tried not to gasp, tried not to move too quickly. For a split second, my flashlight must have caught its face, because I swear I saw it narrow its eyes, like it was reacting to the light. The hair around its head and shoulders looked thicker, and I couldn't see ears or much detail, but it was definitely no bear or person dressed in a suit. It felt wild, powerful, and intelligent in a way that made my hair stand on end. I ducked down, hoping it wouldn't come closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to scream, but I knew that would be stupid. I waited, barely breathing, listening. Minutes passed, I think. I heard soft, heavy steps moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Every now and then, a branch would crack, or leaves would rustle. The tension in my chest was unbearable. I thought about making a run for it, but where would I go in the middle of nowhere at night? I had no weapon, No cell signal, no one expecting me back until after the weekend. I was stuck, so I just sat still and prayed that whatever this thing was, it would lose interest. At some point, the steps seemed to move off. I waited longer than I probably needed to before I dared to peek again. By then, I couldn't see any shape or movement. The normal nighttime sounds were still gone, but at least I no longer heard those heavy footsteps. Still, I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, clutching my flashlight, every tiny sound making me jump. I remember my stomach hurting from all the tension, and my throat was dry. Time moved painfully slow until finally I noticed the first hints of dawn. As soon as there was enough light outside, I crawled out of my tent. My whole body felt shaky and weak, but I needed to see if there was any sign of what had happened. Right where I'd seen that figure, I found large footprints in the damp ground, each one bigger than both my feet put together. They were deep enough that I had to imagine something extremely heavy had stood there. Some branches high up, much higher than I could reach, were snapped clean off. I can't explain how anyone or anything could do that silently or so precisely. It was clear that whatever I saw was real, not a trick of my mind. The ground, the marks, the broken branches, all confirmed it. Nothing was missing from my campsite, and there were no signs of a struggle. I packed my things as fast as I could and got out of there. Hiking back to my car felt like walking on eggshells. I listened hard, trying to catch any sound, half expecting that thing to appear again. But the forest had returned to normal. Birds chirped, squirrels darted around, and the breeze moved the leaves gently, as if nothing had happened. It was almost like the night had just swallowed that moment up and spit out a calm morning instead. When I got back to Clearbrook, I tried telling a friend about it. He didn't make fun of me. Instead, he looked concerned and told me to talk to a park ranger. The ranger didn't laugh either. He said there were occasional strange reports, people seeing large ape-like creatures or hearing weird sounds. He basically warned me that if I ever went out there alone again, I should be careful. He never admitted to believing in Bigfoot or anything like that, but he also didn't dismiss what I said. It was like he knew something, but didn't want to say more. In the days that followed, I poked around a bit, looked up any mentions of weird sightings in that area. I found a few vague posts and local rumors, nothing solid. No one came forward with proof, but I know what I saw and heard. I remember how my gut felt, how my scalp tingled with fear. The forest isn't just a simple place full of animals we can label and understand. Sometimes there are things out there that just don't fit neatly into any category. Even today, I think about that night. I've gone camping again, sure, but never alone in such a remote spot. I'm always more alert, more aware of the silence and the subtle changes in the environment. That night, I realized that I'm not at the top of the food chain out there. There are things that watch from the shadows, things we can't explain. I know it sounds crazy, and maybe that's why I don't talk about it often, but it happened, and I still can't shake the feeling that something huge and unknown passed through my life that night, left its mark, and then just slipped back into the darkness like it never existed. Story 13. I remember that day so vividly, even though it's been over a decade. It was August 2010, a clear afternoon in the backcountry near Pine Hollow, Maine. I'd driven out there with my small rowboat strapped to the roof of my old sedan, hoping to catch some trout in a lake most people in the area barely knew existed. It's not that the locals kept it a secret on purpose. There just wasn't much reason for anyone to go that far into the woods. But I liked the quiet, the sense that I had all that space to myself. The day started off normal enough. I carried the boat down a narrow, overgrown path until I reached the water. The place looked exactly how I remembered: thick, towering pines, ferns blanketing the forest floor, and the lake's surface as smooth as glass. I shoved off and started rowing slowly, the wooden oars making a soft creaking sound. There wasn't another soul around. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional flap of a bird's wings. I fished for a couple of hours, but nothing was biting. It didn't bother me too much. I was there as much for the peace as for the fish. I probably drifted closer to the opposite shore at some point, because when I looked up, I realized I'd let the current take me to a section I'd never explored. The forest looked thicker there, almost tangled, and the trees seemed older, more twisted. That's when I first noticed it, a strange sort of stirring in the brush. At first, I thought maybe it was just the breeze picking up, but the rest of the forest was still. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. It was quiet in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt uneasy, like something was off. I had a pair of binoculars I kept in my tackle box, mostly for watching wildlife. I raised them and tried to focus on where I'd seen those branches move. I expected to see maybe a bear or a moose, something fairly common in those parts. Instead, I caught a glimpse of something that to this day I can't fully explain. It was tall, at least that's the impression I got from the split second I saw it. Covered in dark, rough-looking hair, it seemed to be standing upright before it suddenly crouched down and disappeared behind a cluster of ferns and deadfall. That brief flash of its silhouette really messed with my head. It didn't look right for a bear. Bears don't have shoulders that broad, and when they stand, it's usually more of a balancing act. This thing looked comfortable on two legs, even if I only saw it standing straight for a moment. I pulled the binoculars away, feeling my heart start to race. I wasn't seeing things. I'd been out there long enough to know what the local wildlife looks like. This was something else. My first instinct was to tell myself I must have imagined it, but that sense of being watched was too strong. I heard something like a low, heavy breathing sound drifting across the water, a sort of huffing exhale. It made me freeze. I didn't want to shout or make noise. I just sat there, oars resting on my lap, scanning the shoreline. For several minutes nothing moved. I thought about getting closer, just to see. But then I felt this absolute certainty that I shouldn't. Something in my gut told me that venturing near that bank would be a huge mistake. I still have trouble explaining it, but it was like a primal warning signal going off inside my head. Stay back. Don't push your luck. The silence was almost crushing. Normally, you'd at least hear some birds or the buzzing of insects. Instead, there was just the soft drip of water off my oars and that strange, muffled breathing from somewhere hidden among the trees. I couldn't see it anymore, but I knew it was there. I felt its eyes on me, and it wasn't a friendly feeling. After what felt like forever, I decided I needed to leave. Slowly, I dipped the oars in the water and started rowing back to the opposite side, the side where my car was. I kept my eyes on that patch of forest, half expecting something huge to come crashing through the undergrowth at any second. Nothing happened. Still, the dread didn't lift. It's hard to explain why I was so frightened by just a glimpse of something, but I was. This wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Even the biggest animals I've encountered in Maine have never made me feel so targeted. That's the only word that comes to mind. Targeted. When I finally reached the spot where I'd launched, I didn't linger. I pulled my boat onto the bank, eyes darting between the tree line and the trail back to the road. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but my perception had changed completely. I half expected to see a large, hairy figure step out from behind a tree, but there was just emptiness, a quiet stillness that felt unnatural. I loaded my boat onto the car in record time, my hands shaking. I drove off without a clear plan, just away from that lake. Eventually, I ended up at the home of a guy I knew who'd lived in the area his whole life. I guess I needed to tell someone, to see if they had any idea what I'd encountered. When I described the figure, he didn't laugh or call me crazy. He just nodded in that way people do when they've heard this kind of thing before. He told me that there have always been rumors around these parts, stories of a large, hairy creature that keeps to itself deep in the forests. People rarely get more than a quick glimpse, but those who do never forget it. Hearing that unsettled me even more. I wasn't the only one. This thing, whatever it was, had been around long enough that folks had whispered about it for years. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that I wasn't losing my mind. Fear, because that meant it was real. I drove home that evening, my mind racing. I kept replaying the moment I saw it stand there, how it ducked down so quickly. If I hadn't looked through my binoculars right at that second, maybe I'd have never known it was there. Maybe I'd have just felt uneasy and left. But now I knew something strange was out there. Something that didn't want to be seen, but watched me anyway. Even now, I can't shake that feeling. Nothing dramatic happened, no attack, no chase. But the sense of being watched by something so unusual still gives me chills. I've never gone back to that lake, and I don't plan to. I can't explain what I saw. I can't show you evidence, but I know what I felt, what I glimpsed, and how it stuck with me all these years. That one afternoon changed the way I think about the woods around here. It made me realize that there might be things we don't understand, living right under our noses, staying hidden, watching from a distance. I wish I had some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a bear with mange or some odd trick of the light. But I can't bring myself to buy that. I know what I saw, and it left me with a tension in my chest that I still feel when I think about that quiet, isolated lake. It happened, then it ended, and I've got nothing but a lingering dread and curiosity that will never be satisfied. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than having a definite answer, but it's the truth, and that's all I can offer. Story 14. It happened on a spring morning in April 1999, right outside Oakdale, Ohio. I remember the date clearly because I'd just started working as a local eco-tourism guide a few months earlier, and it felt like I finally had a decent routine going. I was used to showing people around the reserve, mostly quiet groups curious about rare birds, unusual plants, that kind of thing. Nothing ever felt off, at least not until that day. I was leading a small group of 4 through a less-traveled trail. It wasn't some grand expedition, just a slow walk through the woods to spot a few species I knew nested deeper in. The place always felt calm, even a bit hushed, but on that particular morning, it felt different. The air was sort of heavy. I don't know how else to put it. I'd expected to hear a chorus of birds, maybe see some fresh deer tracks, but the forest felt muted. I noticed it when we'd gone about 2 miles in. Normally, by that point, we'd have heard something. Woodpeckers, rustling in the undergrowth, squirrels scurrying away. Instead, it was dead quiet. We stopped for a moment. I didn't say it out loud, but I guess I wanted to confirm I wasn't the only one who noticed the silence. I glanced back at the group. They were looking around too, a bit uncertain, but I just told them to keep their eyes open. No one panicked. They were just curious. Then one guy in the group, I think his name was Tim, pointed ahead silently. I followed his line of sight. About 50 feet away, partially hidden by these tall, mossy trunks, I saw something move. It was big, taller than anyone in the group, and covered in dark, shaggy hair. I only caught a glimpse, maybe a second or two, before it ducked behind the thick tree trunks. I didn't get a perfect look, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears are bulkier. They drop onto all fours, and their movements have a certain shape you can't mistake. This was different. It stood more upright, like a person trying to hide, but not very good at it. I remember feeling my stomach drop. The silence around us made it worse, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to freak anyone out, so I just said something like, "Might have been an animal we startled," and tried to keep my tone even. They looked at me, unsure, but no one screamed or ran off. We decided to keep moving, just a slow and steady pace. I didn't want to linger and somehow corner this thing, whatever it was. The feeling I had was that we were being watched. You know when you just know someone's looking at you, even if you can't see them? It was that, and it kept sending chills through my body. As we moved on, the tension never really left. I didn't want to say much. I kept the group close, making sure nobody wandered off the narrow trail. After maybe another half hour, we reached a small clearing I usually used as a rest point. Normally, I'd encourage everyone to take photos, sip some water, and admire the wildflowers. Instead, I found myself scanning the perimeter, trying to spot any movement. The group sensed my unease and stayed quiet. I knelt down to tie my boot, but what I was really doing was looking at the ground. The soil there was damp, perfect for holding prints. That's when I saw them. Large footprints, much bigger than any humans, somewhat elongated. They were sunken deep into the mud, spaced in a way that suggested something with a huge stride had walked there recently. I can still picture those tracks. The toes were visible, not boot prints, not shoes, and no claw marks like you'd expect from a bear. Just wide, deep impressions that made no sense to me at all. My heart started racing. I felt sweat gather on my forehead despite the cool morning air. I didn't say a word about it. There was no point in stirring up fear. Instead, I decided we should head back, and I chose a different path that curved away from where we saw that figure. The walk back felt longer than it should. Every cracking branch or rustle of leaves made me tense up. I was convinced that creature, or whatever it was, might still be following us, staying just out of sight. I kept looking over my shoulder, pretending to check on the group, but really I was trying to catch another glimpse, or at least confirm it wasn't sneaking up on us. I saw nothing, but the feeling never went away. By the time we got back to the visitors' center, the group was quieter than usual, and so was I. They never pressed me for an explanation, but I could tell they knew something was off. One of them said something like, "We didn't see as many birds as we hoped," and I just nodded, apologizing. I had no idea what to say. After they left, I went to speak with one of the park rangers I was friendly with. I tried to describe what I'd seen as calmly as possible, without sounding like I was making up some crazy story. He didn't laugh. He looked me straight in the eye and said he'd heard whispers of something like that before. Large, hairy, walking upright, always keeping its distance, never causing harm, but always unsettling. He called it the Big Unknown, said there were a few scattered reports over the years, but nothing official. No one had ever gotten a clear photo, and no one stuck around long enough to confirm what they were looking at. It was always a glimpse, a feeling, an impression in the dirt. I didn't know what to make of that. Part of me was relieved I wasn't the only one, but another part of me was more freaked out. It meant I really had seen something real, not a trick of the light or my imagination. The ranger told me just to give it space, not to seek it out. He said there had never been any recorded attacks, just uncomfortable encounters. I guess I should have felt better, but I didn't. I couldn't shake the image from my mind, that huge looming figure slipping behind the trees. I never told the visitors exactly what we saw that day. I figured most wouldn't believe me anyway, and I didn't want to look like a fool. For weeks after, I avoided that particular section of the reserve. I stuck to the more common trails, kept my groups smaller, and paid closer attention to the sounds of the forest. Every time the birds went quiet, I'd tense up, waiting, half expecting to catch another glimpse of that creature peering at us through the foliage. Eventually, life just went on. People came, people went. The forest carried on as usual. I never had another encounter like that, and to this day, I still don't have a clue what we saw. I have no proof, no photos, no hair samples, nothing except my memories and those strange footprints in the mud. But I know what happened was real. It still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when I think about it. The weirdest part is how it just ended. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The forest went back to normal. We never heard a scream, never heard heavy footsteps running off. It just vanished. And I'm left with that single day burned into my mind, April 1999, Oakdale, Ohio. After all these years, I still can't explain it, and I've given up trying. Some things out there don't fit into neat little categories, and maybe they're not supposed to. I never found out what that creature was, and I guess I never will. It remains a silent memory, a strange encounter I can't shake. It never attacked, never made direct contact, but it left a mark on my mind. Sometimes when I'm alone and I think about it, I still feel that uneasy quiet, like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for something just beyond sight. And that feeling, even after all this time, still makes my spine tingle. Story 15. I still remember that day like it happened last week. It was July 2011, and I was working out near the Allegheny National Forest, close to Warren, Pennsylvania. Back then, I was a technician who inspected transmission lines, and I had a pretty standard routine. Start early, head out with my safety gear, my toolkit and my radio, then hike into these remote wooded areas to check on old wooden poles, insulators, and cables. Most days were quiet and uneventful, just me dealing with bugs, the occasional startled deer, and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But on that morning, something felt different from the start. I remember how humid it was. The air felt thicker than usual, and the forest had this heavy silence that put me on edge. Normally, I'd hear birds, maybe squirrels darting around, but that day it was just quiet. I began my inspection at the first pole, not far from a narrow dirt trail that I had to follow. Everything checked out fine there. I moved on, hiking further into an area I didn't visit often. I had a schedule of several spots to inspect, and this particular section was pretty isolated. The ground was damp, the vegetation was thick, and I could see animal tracks, mostly deer and maybe some raccoon prints, across the muddy patches. Nothing unusual at first. About mid-morning, I climbed up one of the older wooden poles to take a look at the hardware on top. It was routine work, just checking for wear and any signs of damage. Once I finished and climbed down, I noticed something strange. There was a smell, not like anything I'd normally smell out there. It wasn't just a dead animal smell or rotting wood. It was almost like a mixture of wet dog fur, sweat, and something else I can't even describe. It hit me out of nowhere. Strong and unpleasant, it made my stomach churn a bit. I looked around, trying to see if there was a carcass or something nearby. I ended up noticing that some branches on a few small trees were broken, and I mean really twisted and snapped, not just fallen. They were bent in a way that suggested something tall and strong had forced them aside, maybe a bear leaning on them. But I'd never seen branches broken at that height before. It felt off. I tried to brush it off in my mind, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. As I kept walking, I found impressions in the ground that stopped me in my tracks. At first glance, they looked like footprints, but much bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. They were broad and long, with what looked like 5 toes, but more spread out than a person's footprint would be. I crouched down and ran my hand lightly over one of them. I remember how the edges of the print were clearly defined in the damp earth. I tried to make sense of it. A bear print can sometimes look odd if smudged, but this was different. It had a shape too human-like, just way larger and deeper. My heart started pounding. There was something about the size and the way it was spaced. It felt like someone, or something, very heavy had walked through there not too long ago. I tried my radio to call back to the base. The signal was scratchy and weak. I managed to get a few words through, but didn't mention what I'd found. I just said I was having some trouble in the area and might try a different route back. I remember my voice sounding strange to my own ears, like I couldn't keep it steady. The smell was still lingering. I decided to loop around and try for a spot I knew had slightly better reception, maybe up a small ridge not too far away. On my way there, I pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth and stepped into a sort of natural clearing. It wasn't large, but the trees opened up enough for me to see several feet in all directions. And that's when I saw it. This tall, dark figure standing near the tree line. It was partially hidden by foliage, but I could make out its shape clearly. I remember every detail. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders were huge and muscular, and its posture was upright like a person. It didn't look like a bear standing on its hind legs. I've seen that before, and this wasn't it. This thing was proportioned differently, more like a large, powerful man, but completely covered in hair and broad in a way that didn't feel human. For a second, I just froze. My heart was beating so hard I swear I could hear it in my ears. I felt this sudden wave of fear, like pure instinct telling me I shouldn't be there. The creature just stood there, staring right back at me. I couldn't see its eyes perfectly from where I was, but I knew it was watching me closely. It tilted its head slightly, as if curious. That small movement made it feel even more real, more intelligent than some random animal sniffing around. I didn't know what to do. Running felt like a bad idea. I just started backing away, very slowly, keeping my eyes on it. My boots were crunching lightly on the undergrowth, and every small sound I made seemed huge in the silence. The creature didn't move closer. It didn't charge or make any noise. It just stood there, watching me leave. I was sweating, and my hands were shaking around my equipment bag. I tried not to breathe too loudly. As I backed up further, a few branches caught on my sleeves, and I stumbled a bit. I panicked for a second, but when I looked again, the figure was still there, just standing, watching. It was like it was letting me go, not interested in chasing me down. I finally turned around and walked faster, heart in my throat, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I kept looking over my shoulder until I could no longer see the clearing. The smell was fading, but I could still sense it if I inhaled deeply. Eventually, I found a small rise where my radio had a bit more reception. I called in to say I was wrapping up and heading back. I didn't mention anything specific about what I saw. I wasn't ready to deal with disbelief or jokes. But I must have sounded weird because my supervisor asked if I was feeling okay. I just mumbled something about feeling a bit off and said I'd be back by evening. I took a longer, more open route back to the main path. I listened carefully to every sound. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I've never felt so watched and vulnerable. My hands were still shaking by the time I made it out onto a more familiar trail where the trees weren't so dense. Once I got back to the base at the end of the day, I was still rattled. I ended up talking to a co-worker I trusted. I didn't give every detail, but I hinted that I saw something I couldn't explain and asked if he'd ever heard weird stories about the forest. He admitted he'd heard rumors, strange sightings, unexplained noises, footprints, but nobody ever had proof. He said people around those parts sometimes talked about a huge, hairy thing roaming deep in the woods, but nobody claimed to know what it was. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept picturing those footprints, that smell, and the way that creature had stared right at me, almost calmly, like it was curious, or maybe just making sure I didn't do anything stupid. It never roared, never threatened me outright, but the fear I felt was unlike anything else. I've gone into the woods plenty of times and seen all sorts of wildlife. This was different. This thing felt like it was something outside the ordinary, something we're not supposed to see. I never went back to that specific route. I stuck to the more accessible areas after that. It's been years now, and I still think about it. Every time I picture its silhouette, I get this tight feeling in my chest. I still can't explain it, and I know most people would never believe me. Without photos or evidence, it's just my word. But I know what I saw, what I felt. There's something out there, something we can't fully understand. And on that day back in July 2011, I came face to face with it. I don't know why it let me walk away unharmed, and I don't know what it was doing there. All I know is that after that encounter, I saw the forest differently. It wasn't just a place of trees and streams anymore. It held secrets I'll probably never understand. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. It happened, and then it was over, leaving me with nothing but questions and a memory that still makes my skin crawl. I never got any closure, and I guess I never will. It's just one of those moments that shakes your understanding of the world and then leaves you there wondering what really might be lurking in those quiet, dark woods. Story 16. I remember that day so clearly, even though it's been almost 2 decades now. It was October 2005, and I was doing fieldwork near Silver Lake in Washington. I was a graduate student in biology, focusing on plant communities and soil composition, and I'd gotten permission to collect samples in a more remote area. The spot I chose wasn't really a marked trail. It was one of those quieter corners where I figured I'd find undisturbed vegetation. I wanted pristine samples, the kind that didn't get trampled by hikers every weekend. The idea was to understand the micro-ecosystems that flourish away from human footprints. I headed out early in the morning. The air was crisp, and the ground was still damp from rain the previous afternoon. I remember carrying my small field kit, my notebook, and a pair of gloves. The forest around Silver Lake can be quiet in a way that's peaceful at first, but after a while, the silence starts to weigh on you. You pick up on every little sound, every snap of a twig, every distant rustle. That day, not long after I started collecting soil samples, I noticed something strange. Some branches, much higher than I could reach without climbing gear, were snapped clean off. I'm not talking about thin twigs that might break in a storm, but thick branches, big enough that you'd need serious force to snap them. There was also moss pulled away in patches that made no sense. It looked like something large had been foraging, but not in the way bears usually scrape around. It felt more intentional, as if something big had been moving through and disturbing things in a pattern I couldn't quite decode. I wrote down these observations in my notebook, feeling a bit uneasy. I've been in the field before. I've seen weird things, but this had a different feel to it. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at every sound, but something was off. I moved on, trying to focus on my actual task. I collected some soil at a deeper layer and carefully bagged it, labeling everything. The quiet around me seemed almost unnatural. Usually you'd hear birds, maybe squirrels, something, but it was dead silent. At some point I decided to follow a small stream that trickled down toward a lower part of the slope. I needed samples closer to the water source for comparison. As I got near, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't a normal forest sound. It was a low, heavy crack, like a thick tree branch being twisted until it broke. I stopped moving and held my breath. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I slowly looked around, trying to see what could have made that noise. Across the stream, a few dozen feet away, I noticed movement behind a cluster of shrubs. At first, it just looked like a dark shape, maybe a stump or a shadow. But then it moved again, definitely something alive. It rose, standing upright. The height was what hit me first. This thing was tall, definitely taller than any human I've ever seen in the woods. And it was broad, so broad that my mind struggled to figure out what I was looking at. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and the shoulders were massive. It stood there, partially obscured by leaves, but I could see enough to tell it was no bear. Bears don't stand like that for long, and this figure looked more like a very large, upright primate than any local wildlife I knew. I felt this surge of adrenaline and fear. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to back away slowly, but I was too shocked to move. The thing didn't charge or roar. It just stood there watching me. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I could feel its gaze. My legs felt weak. I didn't smell anything unusual like people always say in these stories, and I didn't hear it growl. I just saw that silhouette, that towering shape, and I knew I shouldn't be there. I took a step back, trying not to make any sudden moves. My boots scraped against the forest floor, and the creature tilted its head slightly, as if curious or assessing me. I can't say how long we stood like that. Maybe seconds, maybe a full minute. My mind was racing. I considered calling out, but what would I say? And to whom? I was alone. I knew no one would hear me. I thought about taking a photo, but my camera was tucked away in my pack, and I'd have to make too much noise to get it out. I didn't want to provoke anything, so I just backed away, step by step, never turning my back. I tried to keep my breathing calm. After I got maybe 20 or 30 feet away, I stumbled over a root and made a louder noise than I intended. My eyes darted back toward the bushes, and I saw the creature shift its weight and then just sort of disappear deeper into the undergrowth. It moved smoothly, like it was used to navigating that terrain. It didn't break into a run, didn't crash through branches. It just slipped away, as quiet as a ghost. I didn't wait around. Once it was out of sight, I hurried back up toward the rough trail I'd used to get there. I remember shaking so hard I could barely keep my thoughts straight. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Could it have been a human in a costume? That seemed insane. Who would be way out here, dressed up like that, tearing off branches and lurking behind bushes in the middle of nowhere? A bear standing weirdly. No, the proportions were all wrong, and the shoulders were too square. A known primate? Impossible. We don't have gorillas or anything like that in the wild around here. Every scenario I ran through my head felt hollow and stupid. I made it back to my car by midday. I threw my gear in the trunk without my usual care and drove back toward the small town where our makeshift lab was set up. I remember driving in silence, thinking over and over about what I'd just experienced. When I got to the lab and saw one of my colleagues, I knew I had to say something. He must have noticed I was pale and unsettled. I told him what happened, trying not to sound like a lunatic. He listened, didn't laugh, just nodded. He said he'd heard rumors before. Occasionally, someone would report seeing something similar, a tall, hairy figure, a strange presence in the woods. There were never photos, never evidence, but the stories kept popping up through the years. Most people just shrugged it off. But I knew what I saw. I'm still convinced to this day that I laid eyes on something we haven't identified. It didn't attack me, didn't threaten me directly, but the sheer size and the way it watched me felt beyond normal. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, and I've never had that feeling before or since. It's like I encountered a piece of the world that wasn't meant for us to find, something that stays hidden for a reason. After that day, I changed where I collected samples. I stuck closer to known paths, to places where I might at least run into other hikers or researchers. I never went back to that exact spot. Every time I passed near the area, I felt uneasy, like the forest itself had secrets I wasn't supposed to pry into. I paid more attention to subtle signs, the way branches break, the direction of bent saplings, the patterns of disturbed moss. I didn't find anything else like that, but I was always on edge. I never tried to make a big deal out of it. I told only a few people carefully, and their reactions varied from skepticism to quiet belief. Without evidence, there's nothing to show. I ended up completing my research and moved on, but that experience stuck with me. Even now, when I think about it, my stomach knots up. I still feel that chill on the back of my neck, the shock of seeing something that I couldn't place in any textbook or field guide. I guess I'm sharing this now because I've seen enough anonymous accounts online to know I'm not the only one. I don't have proof. I don't have a neat story of being chased or anything dramatic. All I have is that memory, a weird, tense moment by the stream, something big and hairy standing upright, watching me like it was as curious about me as I was terrified of it. Then it just melted away into the green, and life went on, but not quite the same. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or something else. I just know it was there, it saw me, and we shared that moment. It never came back into my life, and I never went looking for it. I left the woods that afternoon feeling smaller, like my understanding of what's out there suddenly had this big blank spot. I've never been able to shake that feeling. It reminds me that we don't know everything, and maybe we never will. That's all I can really say. I saw something I can't identify, and I still think about it, even if it's been almost 20 years. It doesn't make sense, but I know it happened. It happened, and then it just ended, leaving me with questions I'll probably never answer. Story 17. I remember that night so vividly, even though it's been years. It was sometime in June 2008, up in the hills near Alton, New Hampshire. I was working as a contracted night guard, watching over a private reforestation area. The job was simple: walk the perimeter, make sure no one was trespassing, and keep an eye out for poachers. Normally, I'd hear the wind pushing through the pine trees, sometimes the distant rustling of small animals or the buzzing of insects. But that night was different. It was too quiet. The silence hit me as soon as I started my shift around midnight. There was no chirping of crickets, no rustle of leaves, no distant screech of an owl. Just nothing. I remember shining my flashlight around, trying to catch a reflection in some animal's eyes, or maybe see something stirring in the brush. But it all looked empty, like the whole area was holding its breath. I felt it in my gut that something was off. I began walking along the usual path that ran between tall pines and some younger growth, stepping carefully over fallen branches and patches of damp earth. The ground was moist because it had rained lightly in the afternoon. My boots sank a little into the mud, leaving clear impressions. At some point I noticed other prints near mine, big ones, much bigger than any human foot I'd seen. They didn't look like boot tracks, and they definitely weren't from a bear. Bears have those distinct paw shapes with claws, and I knew what they looked like. These were clearly footprints with toes, wide, large toes, too defined to be some odd trick of the mud. I crouched down and ran my hand along one of them, just to make sure I wasn't seeing things. It made my skin crawl because there was no mistaking it. These were massive, human-like footprints. I got this strange chill in my chest. I was out there alone, no backup, no one around for who knows how far. The perimeter fence was maybe 30 yards away through the trees, and beyond that, dense forest. There were no houses close by. I remember standing up, shining my flashlight ahead, and noticing that the prints continued along the perimeter. I followed them just a bit, maybe 15 feet or so, not really wanting to go too far, because something in me said this was not a smart idea. Then I heard this soft scraping sound. It came from my left, behind a thick trunk. It wasn't loud, more like a slow scratch against bark. My mouth went dry. I tilted the flashlight toward the sound, and that's when I caught a glimpse of something. I can't even describe it perfectly. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. The shape was bulky, like a large man covered in dark hair. The flashlight only caught its side for a second before it moved. It stepped behind a cluster of shrubs, and just that motion told me it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move that way. This thing had a fluidity to it, more like a person. but it was huge and broad, and its outline looked more like a giant ape than any person I'd ever seen. I didn't scream, and I didn't run. I just froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I saw. I remember thinking, no one's going to believe me if I say this out loud. I waited, holding my breath, hoping the thing would just go away. The silence was still there, and I realized even more strongly how unnatural it was. It felt like everything else in the forest had decided to keep quiet while this thing passed through. I slowly took a step back, trying not to break a branch or rustle any leaves. I kept my flashlight aimed low because something told me it didn't like the light. As I retreated, I saw the tall shrubs sway gently. It was moving away, deeper into the darkness. I couldn't see it clearly anymore, but I could sense it. Something big was stepping lightly, trying not to be noticed. I know that sounds strange, but I swear it was like it knew I was there, and it was making sure not to come directly at me. I ended up backing into a small clearing where I could see the sky better. There was a faint moonlight, which made me feel slightly less trapped. I stayed quiet for a long time, straining my ears. Slowly, the normal forest sounds came back. A distant hoot, a small scamper, the soft whisper of wind. It was like nature's volume had been turned back up after something very large and intimidating passed through. I thought about my job, about how I was supposed to ensure no trespassers got in. But whatever this was, it wasn't some hunter with a rifle or a drunk teenager messing around. This was something else entirely, something I didn't understand. I felt a kind of respect mixed with fear. It hadn't attacked me, and it seemed to keep its distance once it knew I was there. But I knew I didn't want to push my luck. I took a slow walk back toward the trailer that served as my base for the night. I remember shining my light on the ground one last time and seeing more of those footprints, some a bit smeared but still noticeable. They led off into the thicker part of the forest, where I wasn't about to go. I kept checking behind me as I moved, expecting to see that towering shape peering out from behind a tree. But I never saw it again. The rest of that night was tense, to say the least. I stayed put, only stepping out once more before sunrise to confirm that everything was quiet. It was. By morning, the footprints had lost some of their definition as the ground dried, and I knew no one would take them seriously. Even I started to question if I'd exaggerated them in my mind. But I know what I saw. You can't unsee something like that. After my shift ended, I quietly mentioned to the manager, a man who'd worked in that area for years, that I saw something strange. I didn't go into all the details, just said I'd seen unusual footprints and a large shape moving through the trees. Instead of laughing, he just nodded and said something like, "There've been stories." He didn't press me, and I didn't push it. We both just left it at that. I could tell he wasn't surprised, which might have unsettled me even more. I never got any concrete proof. No photos, no video, nothing but that memory of large, wide footprints and that huge silhouette gliding into the brush. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself it must have been a bear standing oddly on its hind legs or some trick of the shadows. But in my gut, I know that night was different. That silence, those footprints, they were too specific, too unsettling. And the way the creature moved, the way it seemed to know how to stay hidden, that still makes my skin crawl. Over time, I've come to accept that maybe there are things out there we don't fully understand. I know how cliché that might sound, but I can't explain it any other way. All these years later, I still think about that dark shape and those impossible footprints. I never saw it again, never even found a second sign of its presence after that night. It came and went, leaving me with a memory I'll never shake. It was just one night out there in those woods, and everything went back to normal afterward, as if it never happened at all. but I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it. Story 18. I remember that day so clearly. It was in March 2013, just outside Holbrook, Arizona. I worked at a small family-owned hotel in town, and I'd finally gotten a day off. I had permission from a local contact to walk along a less-traveled area of the Navajo reservation. Nothing fancy. I just wanted some peace and quiet to clear my head. The sun was out, the air was dry, and there were these scattered shrubs and a few scrubby trees. The place felt calm and empty at first. It must have been about an hour into my hike, following a rough trail that was only half marked. I'd been enjoying the silence until I realized how silent it actually was. Before, I could hear that faint rustle of wind, maybe a bird or two, the occasional skitter of a small animal. But suddenly, it just went dead quiet, like the whole landscape was holding its breath. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end for no obvious reason. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd just gone a bit farther out than usual, and the wildlife was thinner here. But as I continued, I started noticing weird things on the ground, some marks in the dirt. At first, they looked like a place where a branch or a log had been dragged, but they weren't quite right. The ground was pretty dry and packed, and whatever made those marks must have been heavy. The lines were irregular, like something had moved over the earth awkwardly. I slowed down, feeling more uneasy with each step. Not long after, I found these enormous footprints. They were spaced far apart and definitely not human. The size was just too big, and the shape was off, broader, with what looked like toes but not quite right. Almost like a man's bare foot, but double or triple the size and with a weird proportion. Nothing around there made sense. It wasn't a bear print. It wasn't mountain lion tracks. I knew what those looked like from pictures, and these were totally different. I remember crouching down and running my fingers lightly over one of them, feeling the slight indent where the toes would have been. My heart started to pound because it was so strange and out of place. I had the sudden urge to turn back right then, but for some reason I forced myself forward, telling myself it had to be some weird trick of nature. Then, a bit further ahead, I came around a bend in the trail, just this slight turn where the ground dipped and some rocks jutted out. That's when I saw it. Standing maybe 30 or 40 yards away, there was this tall, dark figure. At first, I could only make out its general shape against the rocks. It stood upright like a human, but it was covered in what looked like dark, reddish-brown hair. Not just a patch here and there, it looked like it was covered head to toe. It was bulky, with long arms, and it didn't move like an animal on all fours. It stood there straight, but kind of hunched at the shoulders. The sun was behind it, so I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was looking at me. I just knew. The way it tilted its head slightly, the way it was positioned, it was aware I was there. I stopped breathing for a second. I literally held my breath, as if that might make me invisible. My chest felt tight, and I remember my ears started to ring. I was just frozen. It didn't rush towards me or growl or anything like that. It just stood there, watching. The silence was crushing. Even the wind seemed to have died. I had this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't be there. It was like a wave of instinctual fear. It's hard to explain. The presence of that thing, whatever it was, just felt wrong, out of place. Or maybe I was the one out of place. I tried to think logically. I thought maybe I'd stumbled on a person wearing some kind of suit, but it didn't look like a costume. The hair seemed natural, uneven in length, but definitely real, not a smooth fake fur. And it was tall, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were broad, the posture too natural to be someone just pretending. My mind was racing, but every logical explanation faded as I stood there, locked in place. Eventually, I managed to take a step back, then another. I kept my eyes on it, moving slowly, trying not to trip. The creature didn't react much. It turned its head slightly, following my movement, but it didn't come after me. I expected it to charge the moment I tried to retreat, but it didn't. It seemed cautious, maybe curious, but not aggressive. That almost made it more unsettling. I had no idea what it wanted or what it was capable of. I took a few more steps back, and I swear I could feel the adrenaline burning in my veins. My legs felt shaky. Every crunch of gravel beneath my boots sounded deafening to me, and I thought for sure that noise would trigger it. But nothing happened. After I put some distance between us, it slowly moved behind a large rock formation. I watched it disappear behind that stone wall, and once it was out of sight, I turned and started walking faster. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I kept expecting to hear heavy footsteps behind me, something crashing through the brush, but it stayed quiet. I must have walked that return route in record time. When I finally made it back to my car, I felt like I'd woken up from a nightmare. I locked myself inside and sat there for a minute, breathing hard. My hands were shaking when I turned the ignition. My heart wouldn't settle down. I wanted to tell myself I saw a bear on its hind legs, or a trick of the light or something that could make sense. But I'd seen its shape too clearly, the way it moved, how it stood there. It was not any normal animal I've ever heard of. Nothing about it fits the animals known to roam that area. Later, back in town, I did something risky. I talked to a local guide I knew casually. He was a quiet guy, not the type to laugh easily. When I told him what happened, he listened, but didn't say much. He didn't call me crazy, which was almost worse. He just mentioned that there were old stories, rumors that some folks in the community passed around, about big, hairy creatures that people occasionally caught glimpses of. Apparently these things are talked about in hushed voices, never confirmed, always dismissed as legends or nonsense. Still, the fact he didn't brush it off completely made me realize I wasn't alone in seeing something strange. I didn't spread the story around too much after that. I mean, who would believe me? I didn't have photos or evidence. And the last thing I wanted was a bunch of people hassling me. I tried researching online, searching forums where people talk about these weird encounters. I found a few threads with vague accounts, people describing tall, hairy figures in remote places, footprints that made no sense. Everyone sounded unsure, just like me. No one had absolute proof. Over time, I tried to push it out of my mind, get back to normal. I kept working at the hotel, recommending hikes and local attractions, but I looked at the landscape differently after that. Every time a guest asked about nature trails, I warned them not to stray too far. I didn't say why, I just said it's always safer to stick to known paths. I knew what I saw, even if I couldn't name it or explain it. The fact that something like that could exist, right out there in the open desert, changed how I saw the world. It made me realize we don't know everything. We act like we do, but we don't. What still gets to me is how it ended so abruptly. One minute I'm face to face with this impossible figure, the next it's gone, leaving only silence and my own stunned mind. No attack, no growls, no dramatic confrontation, just a silent stare down, and then it was over. To this day, I can't fully make sense of it. There was no neat conclusion or explanation. I never saw it again, never heard any definitive stories confirming what I encountered. It was like stepping into a hidden pocket of reality for a moment, and then stumbling back out. I've moved on with my life since then, but I've never forgotten that figure near those rocks. Even now, when I think about it, I get this uneasy feeling, like something is watching me from memory alone. I suppose I'll never really know what it was, and that's probably for the best. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. That day in 2013 was one of them. It just happened and stopped as suddenly as it began, and no matter how many times I replay it in my head, I'm no closer to understanding it than I was back then. Story 19. Back in January of 2006, I decided to try ice fishing on a small, out-of-the-way lake near Mill Haven, Michigan. I was working as a real estate broker at the time, pretty stressed out from juggling clients, deals, and endless paperwork, and I just needed a break. I wanted a quiet place, somewhere without other people crowding the ice and spooking the fish. This particular lake was known to be remote and not very popular during the winter months, which sounded perfect. That morning, the temperature was low enough to feel like my cheeks were getting lightly pinched by the cold air. I had layered up in thick thermal gear and hauled out a small portable shelter, an ice auger, and a basic rod setup. The walk from where I parked my car was longer than I expected, the snow crunching under each step, the trees on the shoreline stark and silent. It felt like I was the only person for miles. Usually I find some comfort in nature's quiet, but this time it felt different, like the silence was too deep, if that makes any sense. After drilling a hole and setting up my shelter on the ice, I settled in and tried to focus on fishing. For the first couple of hours, it was just normal winter fishing, nothing unusual at all. I remember I was actually enjoying the isolation, even felt my nerves settling down a bit. But then, at some point, I realized something. The wind seemed to have died down, and the woods were eerily quiet. No rustle of branches, no distant birds, no hint of any wildlife at all. I even stopped moving inside my shelter just to listen more closely, thinking maybe I'd hear something. Nothing, just this stillness that pressed in on me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it's just winter's hush, but I started feeling uneasy, like when you know you're being watched. I can't say exactly why I looked up when I did. Maybe I just felt that prickly sensation on the back of my neck. I shifted to peek out of my little shelter's opening, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw something moving, maybe 100 yards away, right at the edge of the forest. It was tall. I know everyone says that, but I mean it was really tall. Hard to guess exactly how tall at that distance, but I'm sure it had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. And it was covered in what looked like dark, thick hair. Not a coat, not heavy winter clothing, actual hair or fur. The shape, though, was upright, like a person standing on 2 legs. It moved slowly, kind of deliberately, like it was checking things out. Its silhouette was broad across the shoulders, and I could see the way its arms hung longer than a person's would. My first thought was that it must be a person in a heavy suit, or maybe a hunter wearing some weird ghillie outfit. But even from that distance, the proportions were off. It didn't look like a bulky jacket. It looked like fur. I strained my eyes, blinking a few times, trying to make sense of it, but my mind kept telling me, this isn't right. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, just watching through the small opening of my shelter. I remember feeling this cold sweat on my back, even though it was freezing outside. My mouth went dry, and every instinct told me not to move an inch. I was praying that it didn't notice me, that maybe it would move on. But then, I saw it stop near the edge of the lake, turning its head, or at least what I assumed was its head, toward me. Even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I could tell it was looking in my direction, like it had locked onto me. I can't explain how I knew that, but I did. It was this unsettling sensation, like being caught under a stranger's glare. We stayed like that, me and this thing, for what felt like a long time, but was probably just a handful of seconds. It didn't charge at me or make any threatening move. It just stood there, eyeing me. I didn't hear a roar, a grunt, or anything like that. No sounds at all. The silence was actually more terrifying than if it had roared. At least a roar would make sense, right? But silence, that was worse. It was as if we were both acknowledging each other's presence in this frozen, barren setting, and neither of us knew what to do next. Then, slowly, it started to move away. It didn't bolt or flee. It just turned and took these long, quiet strides back into the tree line. I stayed put, shaking, listening hard for branches snapping or any sign of it circling around, but I didn't hear anything. I waited for another minute or two, feeling every muscle in my body tensed up, then decided I had to leave. The fishing gear didn't matter at that point. I reeled in the line, packed my stuff as quietly and quickly as I could, and headed straight back to my car. I didn't run, even though I wanted to. Running on ice didn't sound like a great idea anyway, but I walked as fast as I dared, constantly glancing over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't following me. When I finally got back to the car, my fingers were trembling so badly that I struggled to fit the key into the ignition. As I sat there with the engine running and the heater blasting, I tried to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I knew I saw. I felt numb and kind of dizzy, like my brain couldn't handle what I'd just witnessed. Later that day, back in town, I stopped at a local store owned by a guy I'd known casually for a few years, just another local face I trusted enough to talk to. I told him I'd seen something strange by the lake. I didn't give too many details at first, just said I'd seen something big, furry, and upright. I expected him to laugh it off or tell me I was crazy. Instead, he got this serious look on his face and told me he'd heard stories from a few people over the years about a strange creature roaming the deeper parts of the forests around here. Nothing confirmed, no pictures, just odd sightings that people rarely spoke about. I remember feeling this mix of relief and dread. Relief that he didn't mock me. Dread that I might have seen something that defies easy explanation. After that, I kind of clammed up. I didn't want to be the Bigfoot guy around town. I had a job to do, clients to meet, houses to show. I went back to my normal routine, but the memory stuck with me. Every time I ventured out to a rural property, every time I stepped near a forest, I'd get that prickly feeling again. I started to look differently at the woods, not as just scenery, but as a place where something might be watching. Over time, I became more cautious and respectful when recommending rural areas to my clients. I'd tell them, half jokingly but still somewhat serious, to be careful if they ever decided to go exploring in the off-season. I never gave them the full story, just a subtle warning that these untouched places might hold surprises. I never did go back to that particular lake. The idea of returning with a camera crossed my mind a few times, but honestly, I didn't want to see that thing again. Maybe some people would call me a coward for not trying to prove what I saw, but after standing face to face with something I couldn't explain and feeling that unsettling quiet, I just didn't have the stomach for it. I preferred to live with the uncertainty rather than risk another encounter. To this day, I still can't wrap my head around it. Nothing dramatic happened. No violence, no chase, no roar, just that silent stare and the impossible reality of what I saw. It ended as abruptly as it began, leaving me with more questions than answers. It's been years now, but the image stays fresh in my mind. A tall, hairy figure standing at the edge of a frozen lake, watching me in total silence before disappearing into the winter forest. I guess some things just aren't meant to be understood. Story 20. I remember that morning in May 2014 so vividly that I can still feel the damp chill of the early hours clinging to my clothes. I had woken up well before sunrise, something I often did back then whenever I wanted to catch a glimpse of rarer bird species. This particular spot, near Greenwood Lake, was known among a few enthusiasts for sightings of a certain elusive bird. Nothing majorly famous, just a rumor of a rare species that sometimes passed through. That's why I was out there, carrying my binoculars, a small bird guide tucked into my backpack, and a bottle of water that still had droplets of condensation on the outside. Getting to that part of the forest wasn't straightforward. The path was barely more than a narrow strip of leaf-littered ground, marked by a few colored ribbons tied to branches. I'd followed those ribbons in the dim pre-dawn light, thinking that I must look a bit crazy out there so early, but it was normal for dedicated birdwatchers like me. The forest was silent in a way that made you pay attention to every tiny sound, every twig snapping, every distant rustle. I remember my breath fogging in front of me when I exhaled, and the way the branches overhead made twisting shadows across the faint moonlight. I reached a spot where the tree canopy opened just a bit, allowing a sliver of sky to show. It felt like a good place to settle in. The idea was to wait quietly until the sun rose enough to light the treetops, giving me a chance to spot the birds as they started their morning routine. I crouched low near a fallen log, letting the cool bark press against my knees, and took a long, slow sip of water. Then I just waited, listening, anticipating that first sign of wing beats or distant chirping. But even before the birds began their soft calls, something else caught my attention. There was this smell. Strange, hard to define, not something I associated with a person or a familiar animal. It was musky, sort of earthy but also sour, like wet fur or decaying leaves, but heavier. I tried to ignore it at first. The forest always has odd scents, but this one lingered, and it made my stomach clench a little. Still, I kept my focus on the treetops, thinking maybe I was just being overly sensitive because I was alone out there. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. The forest was starting to lighten, just enough that I could make out individual leaves high above me. That's when I heard it, a gentle rustling sound behind me. It wasn't loud. It didn't sound aggressive, but it was too steady to be just the wind. Instantly, my heart rate spiked. I've heard deer, I've heard raccoons, I've even startled a fox once. This sound was different. It had a kind of weight behind it, a presence that felt bigger than the usual forest animals. Turning around slowly, I tried to look over my shoulder without making any sudden movements. My body felt tense, and my mind raced through possibilities. A bear. But bears have a certain way of moving, and they tend to be bulkier. This sounded more deliberate. I couldn't see anything at first, just trees and shrubs. But then I noticed a shape partially obscured by a thick trunk. I froze because I realized it wasn't just some random bush. It was something tall, covered in dark, shaggy hair. At first, I thought maybe a person wearing some kind of heavy coat, but who the hell wears a fur coat out here this early in May? Then it sort of shifted slightly, and I saw a face, or at least part of one. The eyes were dark and set deep, watching me. The body was almost entirely hidden behind that trunk, but I could tell it was large, taller than any person I'd expect to be out here. The shoulders were broad, the posture upright. I remember the way my heart pounded so hard that I could feel the pulse in my ears. I didn't smell the odd odor anymore. I'm not sure if it disappeared or if my adrenaline just masked it, but I knew I was seeing something that shouldn't be there, something I couldn't easily identify. For a second, I considered calling out. Then I decided against it. My instincts told me not to attract attention in a louder way. I just stayed still, breathing shallowly. The creature didn't move closer. It just watched me. That's what struck me. There was no immediate aggression. It wasn't snarling or charging. It was just observing me as carefully as I was observing it. And that made it all the more unsettling, because it felt like it was trying to understand me, to figure out if I posed a threat, or if it should be wary. I slowly lowered my binoculars, though I hadn't even had them raised to my eyes at that point. I'd been too stunned. Every movement I made felt amplified in the silence. I began to gather my things, still crouched. I moved my backpack strap over my shoulder as gently as possible, all while keeping my eyes locked on that patch of darkness behind the trunk. I wanted to get out of there. I didn't want to run because I'd heard countless times that running can trigger a pursuit instinct in wild animals. And this thing, whatever it was, had the size and strength to overpower me easily if it decided I was a threat. I took a slow step backward. It didn't move. Another step. Nothing. Then, as I tried to shift my angle to get a clearer look, it did something unexpected. It leaned slightly to one side, almost as if mimicking my attempt to peek. Then it just slipped away behind the trunk, disappearing so smoothly that I almost doubted what I'd seen. There was no loud crashing through underbrush, no heavy footfall, just a quiet, controlled retreat, like it knew exactly how to vanish into the forest without leaving a trace. My heart was hammering, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I kept moving backward until the trees thinned out and I reached a small clearing closer to the road. The morning light was stronger now, and it felt like stepping into a different world. It was so normal outside, that forest interior, just a deserted stretch of country road, a distant hum of something like a passing car a few miles off. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. My hands were shaking as I unscrewed the cap of my water bottle and took another sip. I walked back to my car and made my way toward a nearby gas station. Not because I expected any comfort there, but I needed a moment around other humans, around normality. Inside, I bought a coffee and probably looked pale as a ghost. The attendant was friendly, asked if everything was okay. I shrugged, mentioned I saw something strange in the woods. I didn't go into detail at first, but he kind of nodded, like he'd heard it all before. When I hinted it might have been something big and hairy, he didn't laugh. He said people around the area have talked about seeing something out there a few times. Always from a distance, always these brief encounters with a large, furry figure that disappears before anyone can do anything about it. No attacks, no injuries, just sightings. That actually made me feel slightly less crazy. I think I needed that confirmation, that others had experienced something similar, because my head was spinning with doubts. Could I have imagined it? But the details were too vivid. I know what a bear looks like, and this was not a bear. The shape was too upright. The face was too, I don't know. Human is not the right word, but there was an intelligence there that I can't put into any animal category I'm familiar with. Over the following days, I admit I got obsessed. I scoured local forums, read blog posts, searched for terms like hairy creature near Greenwood Lake or unidentified forest primate New York. Most of it was half-baked rumors, anonymous commenters saying they'd seen something huge watching them in the woods. No solid evidence, just stories that matched mine more closely than I ever expected. Some people said it had to be Bigfoot. Others said maybe it's just a misidentified bear. Others mocked the whole idea. I didn't find comfort in those online debates, just more confusion. To this day, I can't fully explain what I saw. I've never considered myself someone who believes in cryptids or any of that stuff, but I can't deny what I encountered. The feeling of being watched by something unknown still creeps into my mind whenever I remember that day. There's this weird mix of fear and curiosity that I can't shake. It didn't attack me. It didn't even growl or show overt hostility. It just studied me, then disappeared. I've gone bird-watching plenty of times since then, but I've never returned to that exact spot. Now I stick to more popular trails, areas where other hikers pass through regularly. Maybe it makes me feel safer. Maybe it's just an excuse. But I can't help feeling that out there, beyond the edge of those quiet old trees, something is watching. And it's not just me who thinks so. The gas station guy heard similar stories, and a few local blog posts hinted at the same presence. I don't share this story often because most people don't believe it, and honestly I don't blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I'd probably be skeptical too. But I know what I saw, or at least what I think I saw. It left me rattled in a way that normal animal encounters never have. The forest is full of surprises, and not all of them are in the guidebooks. Sometimes I still wonder if I should have stayed longer, tried to get a better look, maybe taken a photo. But in that moment, fear won. I don't regret leaving, but I do feel a lingering frustration that I'll never have the perfect answer. All I can say is that something large, covered in dark hair, stood upright and observed me in that remote corner of the woods near Greenwood Lake back in May 2014. It was real to me then, and it's still real in my mind now. No dramatic ending, no big revelation. The encounter just began and ended in a matter of minutes, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. If you enjoyed these stories, I strongly recommend that you click on this video appearing on the screen right now. In this video, there are new stories, new encounters, and much more. See you in a bit.